piacere.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I think we can start the conference. So, okay, we will use the English language. I hope you will forgive my English. It's a bit, let's say, old-fashioned, because recently I wasn't very much in the UK. But the conference will be live on internet through the cooperation of the Gramsci di Puglia Foundation. Thank you very much, Fondazione Gramsci di Puglia, for this help. And, so it will be live and then will be recorded and put on YouTube. Okay. So what I want to say is to salute everybody and say that we are very pleased to organize this conference on the Iran-Iraq War 1980-1988. First of all, I wanted to bring the salute of the Magnifico Rector of the University of Bari, Professor Stefano Bronzini, and of the director of our department, the Political Science Department, Giuseppe Moro, that couldn't be for us an engagement here present and to bring their salute to the participants. As I said, we are very pleased to organize this conference. Let's say in the last 10-15 years, the chair of international history of the Political Science Department in Bari worked a lot with continuity and quite intensity and passion on the history of the relation between Italy and the Middle East states and nations, giving particular attention to the bilateral relation between Iran and Italy. Besides a source of raw materials and as a market, for Italy, Iran was always a pivotal factor to build a stable and peaceful political order in the Middle East. So given this, our strong interest over Iran and Middle East, we were very pleased to accept the proposal of Rosario Milano and Siavush Rangibar Daemi of the University of St. Andrews, who proposed us to organize this conference on this important moment of international relations that was the Iran-Iraq War of the 80s. We thought it is useful to discuss and to analyze this war because it was one of the bloodiest wars in the late 20th century, with more than 1 million of deaths and several millions of wounded. It was a war that was a departing and defining moment in world politics, provoking the destabilization of the political order in the Middle East. To think about, to analyze this bloody war can give us many insights on world politics, I think. For instance, it shows that the history of the Iraq-Iran war shows that sometimes, very often, wars produce ravage, destruction that with great difficulty can be healed. And not always a war is able to build a new order, a new political stability. On the contrary, we can see that the Iran-Iraq wars was just the beginning of a long political process of economic and political destabilization of the Middle East that saw both Iranian and Iraqi peoples impoverish and lose prosperity. So, this war was a very pivotal, important moment in world politics. I think it's time to try to analyze it and to think about it with a more detached approach, typical of historians. So, to end my salutes, I want to say and repeat that we are very happy to have been able to organize this symposium in cooperation with the British Institute of Persian Studies of London and with the University of St. Andrews. We hope this will be a beginning for other new future chances and possibilities of working together. Thanks also to all the colleagues who accepted to participate in this conference, and to the political science department staff for the help offered to its organization. And I want to thank really warmly all the team that worked to organize this conference, so the organizing committee. Besides the intellectual creator of this symposium, Rosario Milano and Siabush Randi Bari Daeni, I want to thank especially Marco Di Sappia, Irene Paolino, Federico Imparato, Giuseppe Spagnuolo, and the last but not the least, the super Antonella Fiorio. So thank you very much, and I hope it will be an interesting conference. Thank you. I give now the word to Professor Leopoldo Nuti that will lead this afternoon of discussion and intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leopoldo, for accepting to come.
Okay. Thank you very much, Luciano. It's a pleasure to be here. Look forward to listening to the papers, to the presentations, and I think my duty as a chair is to make sure that everybody keeps on time and doesn't talk too much. So I will exert my duties as chair of this panel by giving each one of you about 20 minutes for your presentations, and after 20 minutes I will begin showing increasing signs of nervousness and remind you that your time is up. So we have 6 papers. Are we expected to have a break in between these presentations? I'm asking the organizer.
The last is not.
Oh, okay. So Roberto Lafortezza is not here? Okay, so it's 5 papers, so should we go ahead with the break? Okay. Okay, so let's get started. Our first session is the Iran-Iraq War and the global context, and our first speaker is Professor Luca Riccardi, who is Professor of History and International Relations at the University of Cassino in Southern Lazio, who, as you probably all know, is the author of several books and essays about Italian foreign policy in the 19th and 20th centuries. And Professor Riccardi is going to talk about Italian foreign policy in the Middle East at the end of the 1980s, which, as you probably all know, is also the topic of one of his books. So is one of the foremost authorities we can listen to on this topic. So Luca, the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes.
I apologize to the audience and to my friend Professor Anzari, but I will not speak in English because I'd rather speak in Italian if you allow me to do that.
It will be good for my Italian.
Thank you very much. Grazie Leopoldo. Naturalmente il tema che mi è stato assegnato è un tema molto vasto e naturalmente faccio i ringraziamenti a tutti i colleghi che hanno organizzato questa conferenza e che mi hanno invitato e che sono di nuovo qui a Bari, felicissimo di esserci dopo 3 anni, quindi questa è una cosa molto, molto piacevole. Ma non vorrei rubare tempo, ad altri e dire che questo tema che mi è stato assegnato è un tema molto largo. Allora mi sono permesso, naturalmente nel contributo scritto che poi darò in inglese, naturalmente presenterò tutto il periodo, ma mi sono permesso di scegliere 2 momenti importanti della politica estera italiana negli anni '80 e in Medio Oriente. E questi sono la dichiarazione di Venezia del giugno del 1980 e naturalmente, cercando di armonizzare con gli interessi di questa conferenza, l'atteggiamento italiano di fronte allo scoppio della guerra Iran-Iraq. Però vorrei preliminarmente fare alcune considerazioni. Antonio Varsori anni fa ha scritto che il decennio 80 è stato contrassegnato da una graduale ripresa del ruolo internazionale del Paese. E in fondo, osservando questo decennio, o meglio l'inizio di questo decennio, ci rendiamo conto che qualcosa stava succedendo nel mondo politico italiano. Infatti è molto interessante vedere come si stesse determinando una nuova realtà originata soprattutto da una coscienza dell'importanza delle questioni internazionali che emerse in nuovi elementi della classe dirigente italiana, direi sia democristiani che dei partiti laici, queste personalità che andarono a integrare e quindi ad arricchire la classe dirigente italiana che aveva guidato il paese nel burrascoso ma anche rivoluzionario ventennio precedente. Alcuni di questi elementi, e cito soltanto alcuni nomi: Craxi, Spadolini, Lagorio, Goria, Andreatta, erano delle effettive novità del panorama politico italiano. Altri, Cossiga, Colombo, Andreotti, De Vita, avevano alle spalle già diversi anni, per alcuni direi diversi decenni addirittura, di prima fila nel sistema politico e utilizzarono il periodo a cavallo tra i due decenni, gli anni 70 e gli anni 80, per riciclarsi, trovando nuove collocazioni nel panorama politico che dischiusero loro le porte di nuovi incarichi di governo con importanti riflessi nella conduzione dell'azione internazionale dell'Italia. Alcune delle personalità che ho testé menzionato furono anche all'origine di un mutamento rilevante nella politica italiana in Medio Oriente. E diciamo, è stato giustamente osservato, e dobbiamo questa osservazione a un caro amico che non è più con noi, cioè Luigi Vittorio Ferraris, come l'azione della classe dirigente italiana per il Medio Oriente fu contrassegnata in questo periodo da un rinnovato attivismo. Ecco, il contesto generale mediorientale tra la fine degli anni 70 e il 1980 è noto e è contrassegnato da due eventi fondamentali: il trattato di pace israelo-egiziano, il trattato di Washington del 26 marzo del 1971, e poi la pressoché contestuale rivoluzione iraniana, di cui naturalmente altri parleranno. Quale fu la reazione italiana di fronte al trattato di pace israelo-egiziano? Sul piano ufficiale questo evento fu accolto dal governo italiano con favore, ancorché nei diversi colloqui chi guidava la politica estera italiana allora, cioè Andreotti, che era ancora Presidente del Consiglio, ebbe con gli artefici finali di questo compromesso alcuni colloqui e in fondo si delineò un giudizio abbastanza chiaro di Andreotti e del governo italiano. Il trattato andava considerato un tassello, un primo passo di un cammino che avrebbe dovuto condurre ad un regolamento di pace valido per tutta la regione, cioè doveva essere il primo step. Ecco, naturalmente questa prudente valutazione italiana sull'efficacia generale del Trattato di Washington, vista a 40 anni di distanza, mi permetto di dire, si rivelò alquanto realistica. Una volta concluso l'accordo, infatti, lo sappiamo tutti, il governo israeliano mise in campo un atteggiamento, il governo israeliano guidato dal Likud, mise in campo un atteggiamento sostanzialmente ostruzionistico riguardo quella parte del trattato di pace che prevedeva la creazione di un quadro generale per la soluzione della questione palestinese. E questo portò, lo sappiamo, alle dimissioni del ministro degli esteri Dayan, che non era del Likud, come è noto, e che aprì una nuova spaccatura all'interno del mondo politico israeliano. Di fronte a questi esiti, il governo italiano, che dall'agosto del 1979 era passato sotto la guida di Francesco Cossiga, non poté che confermare il suo giudizio sulla centralità della soluzione della questione palestinese. Questo forse è il primo, la prima conclusione, diciamo, la prima osservazione che possiamo fare. Nella politica italiana nei confronti del Medio Oriente, per tutto il decennio 80 sarà centrale la soluzione della questione palestinese. Ma la politica estera italiana del periodo riguardo al Medio Oriente si incrocia con un altro importante evento, impegno della politica estera italiana, cioè il processo di integrazione europea. E infatti la presidenza di turno italiana della Comunità, che ebbe inizio nel 1980, fu l'opportunità di saldare questi due aspetti fondamentali della politica estera italiana, cioè il processo di integrazione europea e la soluzione delle questioni meridionali, delle questioni mediorientali. Arriviamo al cuore del problema. Con il varo del governo Cossiga II, il 4 aprile del 1980, arriva alla Farnesina Emilio Colombo. E questo muta radicalmente la situazione. Perché, come è stato ricordato, Emilio Colombo è stato uno dei pochi leader democristiani che avesse manifestato uno spiccato interesse nei riguardi degli affari internazionali. Aveva conosciuto un periodo di emarginazione negli anni del governo di solidarietà nazionale, dopo quasi un ventennio di presenza ininterrotta al governo. In quegli anni, proprio quando parlavo di riciclarsi, in senso buono, di rinnovarsi, in quel tempo si era dedicato alla causa dell'integrazione europea, soprattutto sul versante parlamentare, e sarebbe stato l'ultimo presidente del Parlamento europeo ancora composto dai delegati delle assemblee dei singoli Paesi membri. Ecco, quando Colombo assume l'incarico di ministro degli esteri, si dedicò sin dall'inizio con un certo dinamismo a rispondere positivamente al mandato dato dai 9 membri della Comunità Europea ai ministri degli esteri in occasione del vertice europeo del Lussemburgo del 27 e 28 aprile dell'80, di redigere un report da sottomettere alla discussione del Consiglio europeo. Questo Consiglio europeo che si sarebbe dovuto svolgere a Venezia sotto la presidenza italiana il 12-13 giugno. Qual era il cuore di questo mandato? Il cuore di questo mandato era una presa di posizione più pronunciata in materia di diritti politici dei palestinesi. Ed è interessante vedere come su questo tema la triangolazione con Roma, tra Roma, Parigi e Londra, produsse un risultato che sul piano europeo come su quello medio orientale è indubbiamente di valore assoluto. Ma quali erano le soluzioni che in quegli anni si proponevano per la soluzione medio orientale? Spesso si fa confusione, si parla di autonomia, autogoverno. Ecco, entriamo un attimo nelle 4 soluzioni che si proponevano. La prima soluzione era l'autonomia, e questa era la proposta israeliana, cioè che le comunità palestinesi avessero una limitatissima autonomia per una gestione di tipo municipale. Poi c'era l'autogoverno, che era una maggiore autonomia, quindi lasciando agli israeliani soprattutto l'aspetto della sicurezza e non accennando a nessun problema relativo alla sovranità. E questa era la proposta americana, che poi si consolidò nel piano Reagan del 1 settembre del 1982. La terza soluzione di cui si parla nella comunità internazionale è l'autodeterminazione, che è un'espressione vaga, ma che significa una maggiore capacità delle comunità palestinesi dei territori occupati di avere una, sebbene limitata, sovranità. La quarta soluzione, Salah Sandir, è evidentemente lo Stato palestinese, di cui naturalmente sono sostenitori soprattutto i paesi arabi, eccetera, eccetera. Allora, prima cosa interessante della politica estera italiana, delle origini di questa dichiarazione di Venezia, il viaggio che Sadat fa a Roma nell'aprile del 1976. Allora, Sadat arriva in una Roma lunare. La Democrazia Cristiana è sotto attacco durissimo per il caso Lockheed. Viene ricevuta da 3 uomini, Moro, Rumor e il Presidente della Repubblica Leone, i quali per 3 diversi motivi sono totalmente distratti da questioni di politica interna. Moro è preoccupato perché intravede quello che poi, essendo un uomo piuttosto lungimirante, avverrà poco dopo, cioè la crisi del suo governo e la convocazione di elezioni generali che avrebbero potuto preludere a una vittoria clamorosa del Partito Comunista Italiano. Il ministro degli esteri Rumor è sotto shock. Soltanto il mese precedente lui, che era stato 5 volte Presidente del Consiglio, 5 anni segretario della Democrazia Cristiana, è stato subissato di fischi dalla platea del Congresso democristiano. E poi Leone, che ha accusato addirittura di essere Antelope Gobbler, cioè il percettore della famosa, tangente della Lockheed. Il comunicato finale è interessante perché si dice che Egitto e Italia concordano per la costruzione di uno Stato palestinese. Questa presa di posizione viene successivamente ammorbidita. Essa è effettivamente eccessivamente sbilanciata. Infatti, negli anni successivi, la diplomazia italiana scelse la definizione sicuramente meno impegnativa politicamente, ma che collocava sicuramente la diplomazia italiana in una posizione molto chiara. L'Italia sceglie per la via della autodeterminazione palestinese. Questa decisione rappresenta bene l'itinerario che negli anni precedenti il 1980 il governo italiano aveva seguito nei suoi rapporti con l'Organizzazione per la Liberazione della Palestina. E qui noi vediamo un lungo elenco di incontri riservati che la diplomazia italiana e il Ministero degli Esteri fa con esponenti palestinesi di crescente importanza. Per la gioia del professor Monzari posso dire che il primo esponente diplomatico italiano di vertice che ha incontrato un rappresentante dell'Organizzazione della Liberazione della Palestina è l'ambasciatore Ducci. E questo incontro probabilmente si inquadra in quella serie di relazioni spesso anche oblique tra mondo politico italiano e mondo palestinese che poi matura nel Lodo Moro. Molto importante è il viaggio che il ministro degli esteri Forlani nel 1977 fa al Cairo, dove per la prima volta nella storia della politica estera italiana incontra quello che noi chiamiamo il responsabile del dipartimento politico dell'ULP, cioè il ministro degli esteri, Farouk Kaddoumi. Ed è lì, proprio durante questo incontro, che si elabora, mi permetto di definirla io così, una sorta di dottrina Forlani sulla questione palestinese. Perché Kaddoumi dice a Forlani: voi dovete stabilire rapporti diplomatici con i palestinesi, con l'ONP. E Forlani, da cautissimo uomo politico democristiano tal era, cammina sulle uova e gli dice: ma noi vi vogliamo tanto bene, vi seguiamo, vi appoggiamo. Però gli spiega anche qual è, e la spiegherà anche in Parlamento il mese successivo, qual è la sua idea, perché l'Italia non riconosce formalmente e diplomaticamente, come hanno fatto alcuni altri paesi, per esempio la Grecia, l'Organizzazione per la Liberazione della Palestina. Dice Forlani: mai fare passi che possano pregiudicare la funzione dell'Italia in quanto elemento di contatti e di moderazione per tutti i contendenti. Cioè, può sembrare strano, ma in fondo questa idea di Forlani è una sorta di attualizzazione alla fine degli anni 70 di quella equidistanza di origine fanfaniana. E questa diventa a tutti gli effetti la politica italiana nei confronti del mondo palestinese. Tant'è che gli anni '80 vedono questa nuova elaborazione, scusate, qui c'ho delle carte, ma ecco, elaborazione di questa dottrina. Questo è il successore di Forlani, cioè il ministro Malfatti, che nel 1979 dice: non è auspicabile mai compiere atti destinati a rimanere fine a se stessi, cioè c'è una condanna, diciamo, del sensazionalismo, tenendo ben presente che gesti di rilevante portata al fine di avere concreti affetti politici debbono essere intesi per la loro capacità di introdurre nuovi elementi positivi che contribuiscano al raggiungimento dell'obiettivo cui tendiamo, cioè la pace in Medio Oriente. Questo è un passaggio molto importante, perché vediamo in piena elaborazione una strategia che fa dell'Italia una potenza saggia e ragionevole, che non vuole litigare con nessuno. Infatti in Parlamento Forlani dice: la strategia italiana è parlare con tutti. Lezione, secondo me, valida universalmente. Quindi la dichiarazione di Venezia nasce sulla scorta di questi ragionamenti e, diciamo, vuole essere il compimento di atti positivi, degli atti positivi che la comunità internazionale ha prodotto nella direzione di un regolamento globale di pace. Qui è molto interessante vedere la posizione del governo Thatcher, che è profondamente sintonica con quello del governo italiano. Il 6 giugno dell'80 Carrington, il ministro degli esteri britannico, fa tutto un ragionamento alla vigilia della conferenza di Venezia e si intravede nel suo ragionamento una critica nei confronti degli Stati Uniti. Cioè Carrington sostiene che si stia aprendo un vacuum pericoloso in Medio Oriente, causato dal confronto elettorale imminente negli Stati Uniti. E perché è pericoloso questo? Perché sembra aprirsi l'opportunità per l'Unione Sovietica di recuperare il terreno perduto che si era perduto in Medio Oriente. E qui è interessante vedere che la Gran Bretagna, insieme all'Italia e alla Francia, individuano un ruolo specifico per la comunità europea, quindi per l'Europa, di riempire il vuoto lasciato dall'interesse alterno determinato dalla politica interna americana. E in fondo la base britannica, la base del ragionamento britannico è molto simile a quella italiana: la sicurezza di Israele, primo, e poi prendere in considerazione i diritti politici dei palestinesi, o meglio, endorsement of Palestinian self-determination. E è tra gli inglesi 25. Ho finito. Va bene, vado rapidamente. Qual è la posizione americana rispetto alla dichiarazione di Venezia, la quale, ve la riassumo, diciamo, il punto focale è la decisione collegiale di chiedere la partecipazione dell'Organizzazione di Liberazione della Palestina a un eventuale negoziato di pace. La posizione americana è molto diffidente, tant'è che all'inizio, prima della posizione, prima del vertice europeo, vengono fatte delle pressioni diplomatiche perché la dichiarazione affermi con grande chiarezza che non contraddice il contenuto degli accordi israelo-egiziani. Arrivo, diciamo, alla fine. L'idea italiana, inglese e francese è la creazione di un homeland palestinese, quindi non uno Stato, ma una realtà autogovernata il cui sviluppo futuro non sia pregiudicato, e questo unisce i paesi europei in quel momento molto più. Per il resto vi ringrazio. Naturalmente la colpa degli errori di questa, come dice il nostro carissimo collega in un suo bellissimo libro, la colpa degli errori di questa comunicazione è tutto mia, le interpretazioni per favore discutiamole. Grazie.
Grazie Luca, thank you Professor Riccardi. I apologize for asking you to keep the time. So the next speaker in the panel is Federico Scalano, who is Associate Professor of History and International Relations at the Department of Humanities and Cultural Heritage of the University of Campania. He has written several books with the main focus on political and diplomatic relations between Italy and the German-speaking area, and on the history of Italian and German foreign policy. So today, since he's a specialist of Germany, he's going to present about the Federal Republic of Germany and the Iran-Iraq War. Rico, you have about 20-25 minutes.
Thank you very much, Aldo. And I want to say thank you to the organizers, and especially to my old friend Luciano Monzari. In front of the German embassy in Tehran, the Iranian authorities have erected a sign with descriptions in English and Persian, showing images of the victims and accusing with spirited words the government of the Federal Republic of Germany of aiming factories Saddam Hussein with chemical weapons and related technology, and therefore to be responsible for the gas attacks carried out by later in the war against Iran. German terms such as Karl. Thank you. And sorry, I hope that you didn't miss my first book. Yes, so German firms such as Count Kolbow, Dryhead, and Este, and the Hamburg-based water engineering trading made an essential contribution to the construction of Iraqi chemical weapons production plants. But Berlin has always denied any responsibility, arguing that German firms acted without any approval or knowledge from the German government. Actually, the Federal Republic of Germany strove to contribute to a negotiated solution to the long conflict and to mediate between the parties. When the United States became increasingly favorable towards Iraq, Germany kept on maintaining good relations with Iran, also to prevent it from falling under Soviet influence. Tehran, on the other hand, took an ongoing interest for the relations with the Federal Republic of Germany. Due to the crisis of the American hostages captured by the Iranian Islamist students on November 4, 1979, the German government, under pressure from the United States, had been obliged to adhere to the economic sanctions against Iran, but it did so very reluctantly and by expressing its contrary. Sadek Tabatabai, Iranian Secretary of State to the Council of Ministers, and later both first Vice President of the Council of Ministers and government spokesman, was a biochemist who had graduated in Germany and was very close to Khomeini, also for family reasons, turned to German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher to mediate for the solution of the crisis of the American hostages held in Iran. The first meeting between Tabatabai and Genscher took place at Bonn on March 21st, 1980. Thanks to Genscher and to the efforts of the German ambassador in Iran, Kurt Ritze, two secret meetings took place in Bonn on September 16th and September 18th, 1980, between Tabatabai and the United States Secretary of State Warren Christopher, headed by Genscher, to whom the Iranians also asked to be the guarantor of the agreement. As written by Genscher in his memories, the release of the hostages did not happen before the United States presidential elections of November 4, 1980, as the American President Carter wished, precisely because of the attack by Iran on September 22nd. The Iranians suspected that the Americans could have sponsored the attack and thus decided to not aid Carter in the United States elections. It is important to say that historically Germany had good relations with both the Arabs and the Persians, and with the outbreak of the conflict, Bonn decided to keep relations with both sides, also for economic reasons, due to the importance of the commercial exchanges it had with both Iran and Iraq. The Ministerial Director of the German Ministry of Foreign Relations, Walter Gorenfloss, was responsible for the section for the Third World and Iran, wrote in January 1981 that Bonn had to remain strictly neutral in the conflict, but that it was interested in having good political relations and intense economic relations with both warring parties. It was necessary, after the release of the hostages that took place on January 19th, to reinitiate few diplomatic relations and economic dealings with Iran, as well as to send an envoy for sounding both in Baghdad and Tehran. Since 1981, the German government authorized the sending of arms replacement components to Iran, which had been scheduled before the revolution of 1979, but not of new weapons or ammunition, for a total of almost 200 million marks from the period 1981 and 1986 by the firm Fritz Werner and of 10 million marks by other firms. As written by the ministerial director of the Ministry of Foreign Relations, Alwaya Yonek, who was responsible for the Office of Foreign Trade, I quote, "If we don't provide the replacement components already expected in the agreements, we would lose the possibility to mediate with Iran and also our reliability with other countries. The steadiness and reliability of our foreign economic policy under pressure is fundamental for the success of our exports." Iran, on the other hand, wished for good relations with the German Federal Republic. The Iranian Minister of Foreign Relations, Mousavi, went to Bonn on October 8, 1981, and his successor, Velayati, did the same only 3 months after. Iran appreciated the fact that Bonn had officially declared that the Iranian Revolution and the new regime corresponded to the will of the Iranian people. Regarding the relations with the United States, Gramsci, while confirming the strength of his country's alliance with America, declared that West Germany and Iran determined their relations according to their own interests and not according to the relations they had with other states. When Saddam Hussein's attack failed and it was Iran that wanted to continue the war by aiming at Saddam's fall and the creation of a Shiite state in Iraq in 1982, the United States deleted Iran from the list of states that were considered sponsors of terrorism and started to support it in an increasing way, despite the fact that Iraq, as it is known, purchased most of its weapons in the Soviet Union, and secondly, in France. On January 19, 1984, it was Iran to be included into the United States list of sponsored states of terrorism. Gramsci, who had never visited Iran at the time of the Shah, went to Tehran in July 1984, being the first important Western political exponent to visit the Islamic Republic, despite the fact that the United States had declared Iran a sponsored state of terrorism. Gramsci declared not to become a mediator for the solution of the conflict, but to support the efforts of the United Nations General Secretary, Perez de Cuellar. The Iranian Minister of Foreign Relations, Velayati, was very frank and told him that if Iran could not renounce to the fall of Saddam, the Iranian claims for war liberation were not indispensable. On September 4, 1984, Gramsci also met the Iraqi Minister of Foreign Relations, Tariq Aziz, who underlined how Iraq was ready to end the war if its territorial and political integrity would have been respected, but who also showed understanding for the German will to maintain and expand the political relations with Iran. Since it seemed, as Gramsci wrote to American State Secretary Schultz, that Iraq was interested not only in having an economic cooperation with the US, but also in having political talks, despite the good relations it had with the Soviet Union. Genscher said that Iraq wanted a policy of non-alignment and opted for a larger Western effort aimed at finding a solution on the conflict. Already in February 1984, the United States warned the German government of the cold firm's responsibility of these German firms, German industry, for the construction at Samarra of an Iraqi plant for the production of chemical weapons. But according to an inquiry made by the German government, the latter was designed for the production of pesticides, and thus this building was allowed by the German commercial laws. Even it could be transformed into a plant for the production of gas. In October 1984, two experts of the German government, Manfred Reuch and Klaus-Dieter Haferkamp, visited the plant of Samarra after agreements with the Iraqi government and came to the conclusion that the plant did not produce chemical weapons. 3 years later, however, the German government admitted that in the desert near Samarra and Fallujah there were great plants for the production of chemical weapons. In any case, as written in April 1988 by Burkhard Nagel, who was the responsible for the control of German exportations in German foreign ministry, the problem was that almost all the substances needed for the production of chemical weapons were largely sold as products for civilian use, and thus an effective control made only for half of such substances would have represented a serious hindrance for chemical commerce. He concluded that, I quote, "We had to balance our interest in preventing the proliferation of chemical weapons with our economic interest as the presumptive major global exporter of chemical products." Germany didn't want to stop its chemical exportations. Since November 1987, a penal inquiry was opened against 7 German firms suspected of having violated the export laws, which involved 22 representatives of such firms. 7 of them were arrested temporarily in 1990. The salaries against half of these representatives did not lead to penal consequences. On the other half, 1 was not processed due to the expiry of terms, and of the remaining 10, 3 were discharged, 2 benefited from prescription, and 3 were sentenced to penalties between 6 months and 1 year, but in any case, they benefited from suspension, and thus none of them went to jail. The opposition attacked in the parliament and on the press the German government, declaring that the latter, being in doubt between morality and advantages deriving from exporters, had chosen the latter. It was in 1987 that the German government, joining the Italian and Japanese ones that had themselves maintained positive relations with Iran, was able to give an important contribution to reach peace. In that moment, Germany, Italy and Japan were all non-permanent members of the United States Security Council. The point was to vote a balanced resolution that could be accepted by both warring states. On July 20, 1987, the Security Council voted with unanimity the resolution number 598. This resolution, even not mentioning Iraq, expressing condemnation for the use of chemical weapons, for the bombings against civilians, and asked for Iran and Iraq to cease the hostilities as well to retreat their military forces back to the borders recognized by the international community. The resolution was accepted by Baghdad, but at least initially not by Iran, since it lacked clear condemnation of Iraq as the aggressor. Genscher, forecasting the Iranian objections, declared on the same day of the declaration of the resolution that the ceasefire and the retreat of the military contingents would have been not simultaneous as hoped by Teheran. 4 days later, the German Minister of Foreign Relations, during an interview to the German radio, condemned Iraq by declaring without compromise that the war had been started by Baghdad and that the latter had also employed chemical gas. On July 28, 4 days after, Genscher interrupted the summer holidays at Berchtesgaden to meet Tariq Aziz, according to whom the last declaration of the German minister were comparable to the declaration of war on Iraq. The Iraqi minister considered the German stand of separating the ceasefire from the military evacuation of the occupied territories as something unacceptable. If the ceasefire would have been decided in 1987, but the date of the Iranian troops withdrawal would have not been fixed, this would have been unreasonable and would have favored terror. Despite this problem, however, Germany was too much important for Iraq due to the existing economic and historical links. And thus Baghdad did not want to break diplomatic relations with the Germans. On 18th and 19th November 1987, Genscher went to Baghdad, where he met Saddam Hussein, to confirm the importance for Iraq of having positive political and economic relations with both. Genscher, on the other hand, confirmed that Germany wanted to have friendly relations with both the Iraqi and the Iranian peoples. The visit was a success and confirmed the Iraqi support to Resolution 598, as well as the importance of the relations existing between Iraq and Germany. Germany conceded to Iraq a loan of 300 million marks. During 1988, the German diplomacy prosecuted its efforts for convincing Iran to adopt the Resolution 598. On April 1, 1988, the German diplomat Schlangenweit wrote to the Iranian Prime Minister Mousavi a letter of thanks from Chancellor Kohl for the Iranian commitment in obtaining the liberation of 2 German hostages who were prisoners for the Shiite militias in Lebanon. In the letter, Kohl confirmed the strong condemnation coming from both governments for the threatened use of chemical weapons made by Iran. On May 9, 1988, it was again Germany that promoted the resolution of the United Nations condemning the use of chemical weapons and their proliferation. On July 18, 1988, the Iranian President Khamenei announced that Iran accepted without conditions the resolution 598. The end of the hostilities took place on the following August 20th, after having been delayed by Saddam. According to Rosario Milano, peace, in addition to the renewed U.S. commitment in the Persian Gulf that made Tehran worried about the possibility of a direct confrontation with the United States, the peace became possible when the leaders of the Islamic Republic of Iran became certain that they could obtain from the dialogue with the West, from countries like Germany and Italy, some advantages that would have been surely superior to any advantage that could have been obtained with another military offensive. Later, Genscher met several times with Rayad, Vice Minister of Foreign Relations, Lariani, and during his visit to Tehran in November 1988, the Iranian political leaders, including the moderate president of the parliament, Rafsanjani. The Iranians expressed their appreciation for Genscher's role and for his international stature, and hoped for an important German contribution to the Iranian economy and to the reconstruction of their country. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Federico, apologies for this abrupt recording of time limit. And our next speaker is Paolo Soave, who is Associate Professor of History and International Relations at the Department of Political and Social Science at the University of Bologna for Greece. And Paolo has written several books on different topics on Italian foreign policy, history of Italian foreign policy. And among his most recent publications, his book is co-edited with the organizer of this conference, Professor Gonzali, on Italy and the Middle East, Geopolitics, Dialogue and Power during the Cold War. Paolo is going to give a paper on the United States and the Iran-Iraq War, and again, you have 20 to 25 minutes.
Thank you, Professor Nuti, and thank you to all the organizers. It's quite complicated trying to outline this, so in a few minutes, the U.S. posture toward the Iran-Iraq war. However, I will start saying that it was quite interesting studying some primary sources collected by some research institutes. For instance, Wilson Center, National Security Archive, George Washington University, outline key aspects of U.S. foreign policy in that region. Also interesting to me was studying the so-called critical oral history, that basically is a very rich debate involving some former CIA agents and U.S. former officials, for instance, Richard Murphy, Charles Cogan, but also former United Nations diplomats, John Domenico Piccolo. So it was very interesting. I found that there is a very interesting chance for further development. Well, first of all, let me say that for the USA, a war starting even before than September 1980, with the outbreak of hostilities, as U.S. position towards Iran had been already compromised, as you know. Unhappy last year or so, Carter presidency with the end of relations, the hostages crisis, and so the problem was that on one hand there were so bad relations with Tehran, on the other hand, there were no relations at all with Iraq, as since 1967, after the Six-Day War, bilateral relations collapsed. Iraq was considered a pro-Soviet agent in the Middle East area, as USSR was the first arms supplier for Iraq, and at the same time, Saddam Hussein was considered a pro-international terrorism supporter. So it was quite complicated for USA to deal with the war, as they had neither allies nor reliable strategic partners. The first position was declaration of neutrality from Carter. Basically, neutrality was the fact that US were involved, committed in preventing armed supplies for both belligerents. I have to say that there was even an attempt in order to exploit the outbreak of hostilities led by CIA. We have a former agent, Charles Cogan, who said that he warned Tehran that an Iraqi attack was coming, was imminent. But I have to say that there was no chance at all for improvement of bilateral relations between Washington and Tehran. And as you know, and basically until now, until our present days, the Iranian national narrative on that war was that war against Iraq was basically a proxy war, and the real war was that opposed Iraq to the Western powers, and especially to USA. All of them involved in trying to contain the spread of Iranian influence, and especially of Iranian revolution in the Middle East. So, despite neutrality, Carter tried his last days at the White House to improve relations with Tehran. However, we have to say that when Reagan inaugurated his presidency, he had really a good chance in order to try to change conditions with Tehran, as the hostages were finally released. The last 52 hostages after more than 400 days. So it was a possible turn in relations with Tehran. The problem was that since 1982, it was clear that the war was changing. The first Iraqi military operation had failed, and as a consequence, Iran was on the verge of a new initiative, and there was a serial threat at the White House, an Iranian victory. So the position of Reagan was changing, no longer neutrality. But I have to say that there was the first document prepared by former National Security Advisor Brzezinski, and I found it really interesting also for the entire course of that war. And I would like to quote just a few words. It was the document really after a few days the outbreak of hostilities. This document is titled Long-Term Implication of Iran-Iraq War, October 3rd, 1980. And Brzezinski wrote to President Carter, "We need to initiate both more subtle and more covert initiatives regarding Iran, while reinforcing our position in Saudi Arabia and while not clashing with Arab aspirations, and thus while not openly opposing Iraq. We should actively seek new contacts with Iran to explore the possibility of helping it just enough to put sufficient pressure on Iraq to pull back from most, if not all, of its current acquisitions. Only by attempting to do so can we make the needed effort to safeguard Iran from Soviet penetration or internal disintegration." Basically, this first analysis was shared by the Reagan administration. So, Brzezinski outlined all the key points for the US posture with regard to the war. Firstly, the war will be a long war, despite initial Iraqi hopes. As a consequence, USA had real strategic interest in preventing the victory of one part or the other. So the best outcome of war, of a long-term war, would be an outcome without winning and defeated parts. In other terms, to preserve the strategic balance of power in the Persian Gulf, and in doing so, to get both Iraq and Iran weaker than before the war. Secondly, to prevent an improvement of Soviet influence in the area. Moscow had a very interesting factor of influence. Moscow was the first arms supplier for Iraq, so it was clear that it had a chance to launch some diplomatic initiative and to achieve some consensus in Tehran and counterbalance its influence in the area. So USA wanted to prevent a stronger Soviet action and influence. Another point was to assure US partners in the area, especially in the Persian Gulf, first of course Saudi Arabia, and to prevent a broader conflict. Then, most relevant point for all the Western industrialized countries to secure free access to oil flows. Last but not least, in a long-term perspective, to pave the way for improvement of relations with Tehran. That was the real dream both for Carter and Reagan to some extent. So what really happened was that Reagan moved from initial neutrality proclaimed by Carter, then decided to make the famous tilt in favor of Iraq, as Iraq was really in a bad military situation starting from 1982 when Iran was able to reverse the strategic course of war. And in doing so, Donald Rumsfeld led a mission to Baghdad where he offered really everything, not only financial support but also armed supplies. Moreover, USA decided to remove Iraq from the list of countries supporting international terrorism, and in 1984 there was the restoration of diplomatic relations. However, there was a last but not least critical point. The fact that Iraq was using chemical weapons, and when Iranian claims to the United Nations were so clear and largely shared by international community, it was clear that USA was no longer possible to deny that problem, and USA decided to officially condemn the use of chemical weapons, but in a very ambiguous way. Secretary of State George Shultz instructed his diplomats to the United Nations that they had to promote a moderate resolution. In other words, a resolution of general condemnation of the use of chemical weapons, but not a resolution of condemnation of the Iraqi use of chemical weapons. That was another thing, okay? However, what really USA achieved supporting Iraq was a longer war, was to prevent Iranian victory. And as a consequence, quite paradoxically, Reagan's administration understood that Iran was even more necessary as a pivotal factor in the Middle East for so relevant strategic reasons. So there was another debate inside the Reagan administration, and as you know, the final outcome was the controversial and famous, well-known Iron Contrast affair or scandal. Once again, what really moved Reagan administration to do so? According to historians, even former US officials, the fact that also Reagan was obsessed by a few American hostages held by some pro-Iran organizations in Lebanon. So there was a problem, a long-term problem, hostages. And in long-term perspective, the chance to improve relations with terror. Once again, a new attempt. It was harshly debated inside the administration. We know that George Shultz was strongly against and opposed such move, basically arguing that supporting Iran was against the Western interest in the area. However, once again, there was a secret mission headed by Robert McFarland to Tehran, and it was interesting because McFarland found in Iran that the only thing that was really interesting to Tehran was the restoring of former old armed supplies. As you know, in the Shah's era, as Iran had been one of the two famous twin pillars, the other was Saudi Arabia. So the Iranians were still waiting for the old armed supplies. Carter had decided to cut off. No real interest in Tehran for the perspective of new diplomatic relations or a political comprehension with Washington. And finally, the decision was assumed by President Reagan, and we know from Reagan's memoirs that he decided in a few seconds. He was really convinced, despite the fact that it was such a controversial decision, which bypassed really important congressional bans. However, it was his decision, which was implemented with the central role of Israel. That was the state who really delivered the weapons to Iran. But such move was really exploited by Tehran with regards to create new difficulties to USA. And as you know, the scandal was created by the Iranians. The Iranians gave the news of this secret operation to a Lebanese newspaper, and that was the worst moment in Reagan presidency. Almost an impeachment, but what was more important in foreign policy, foreign affairs, the fact that in doing so, Reagan never achieved the improvement of relations with Tehran, and of course, he didn't achieve strong trust in Baghdad, as Saddam Hussein was absolutely furious and wrote a letter to President Reagan. So it was really a very controversial point, but I don't want to deepen it, as tomorrow I suppose President Milano or other colleagues will focus on that problem. So what really happened as a consequence of that controversial decision was that basically Reagan administration was even more forced to support Iraqi military reform. And there was another important turning point in 1987 when USA decided to reflag Kuwaitian oil tankers crossing the Persian Gulf. That was a very important decision because it determined a condition of undeclared war between USA and Iran, with some incidents, and as you know, the highest point, critical point, and the most dramatic point was the shutdown of an Iranian civilian airplane by the USS Benzan. But quite surprising, as Federico Scarano said before, a few days later, quite surprisingly, Ayatollah Khomeini decided to accept United Nations Resolution 598 imposing a ceasefire. That was the end of the war, a 8 years long war. And I found interesting what said Giandomenico Picco, former United Nations diplomat, who outlined the fact that he found Secretary of State George Shultz not really interested in promoting or supporting the ceasefire. Maybe this is a possible interpretation, because even in the final part of the war, USA wanted to offer Iraq the last chance to improve their strategic position against Iran. However, it was the end of war, and in conclusion, I can say that to me, it's quite clear that all the American posture with regards to the war was aimed at pursuing some war aims, and the most important was preserving the strategic balance of power in the Western interest, in the perspective of Cold War, or if you prefer, in the perspective of the so-called Second Cold War, which was happening, as you know, in a very broader scenario, also involving Afghanistan and also involving Europe, okay? Really, the USA achieved this goal. But if you consider the question in political terms, I would say that USA was not so successful because they never achieved an improvement in relations with Iran. And if you know, as you know, soon after the end of that war, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. So the strategic partnership never became an alliance or a change of attitude in Saddam Hussein's foreign policy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Paolo. Well ahead of time. That gives 6 extra minutes to the next speaker. Who is Professor Fabio Bettanin, former full professor of history of international politics and of history of contemporary Russia at Università di Napoli Orientale. Professor Bettanin has written several books on Russian and Soviet foreign policy, and his last book was a must-read for anyone who wants to understand what is going on today, Putin and Moldova, written a few years ago, but still very much worthy of your attention. And Professor Bettanin will speak about the Soviet Union and the Iran-Iraq war. So, Fabio, you have 26 minutes.
No, 20. No, I take only 20. But thank you very much for your kind words. First of all, I apologize with the English college, but for some more problems of head, I was unable to prepare my relations in English, and so to better express my thought, I speak in Italian. Apologize. Sì, io già nell'abstract ho detto che cercherò di seguire un approccio matrioska all'arte, no? Sì, partendo dal lungo periodo, perché credo che sia importante tenere conto che per il nostro Medio Oriente da secoli per la Russia è il Blижний Восток, da secoli, credo alla metà del XVI secolo, quando la Russia si affacciò, la Moscovia si affacciò al Mar Caspio, entrando in contatto con l'impero persiano, con l'impero persiano. È una regione vasta e indefinita, nella quale poi la presenza russa è stata sempre limitata e filtrata attraverso, dico cose un po' note per organizzare però il mio pensiero attorno a alcune chiavi interpretative, no? I rapporti con i grandi imperi presenti nell'area, la Persia, prima poi l'impero ottomano, poi Francia e Inghilterra. Perché richiamo questo passato? Perché io sono un contemporaneista, quando la longa durée mi ispira sempre qualche dubbio, qualche perplessità, però credo che qui sia necessario perché quando negli anni 50 l'Unione Sovietica si riaffacciò di nuovo in un'area che non conosceva, ecco, questo lontano passato esercita un ruolo importante in almeno due sensi, nel pare almeno, e cioè prima considera gli stati storici, uso un anacronismo perché è riferito a quello che accade in Europa, ma gli stati storici dell'area lo sono anche durante la guerra tra Iran e Iraq, secondo me, l'Iran e la Turchia, stati marginali, eccetera, ma soprattutto l'Iran. Ecco, l'Iraq non fu mai considerato dall'Unione Sovietica come qualcosa che fosse alla pari con capacità di organizzare l'area con l'Iran. Poi a questi due stati si aggiunse per motivi demografici, storici, politici, geografici, dopo l'apertura del canale di Suez e l'Egitto. Anche questa è una storia nota. E l'altro aspetto importante, perché poi questo è il problema negli anni 50, è chi era in grado di unificare l'area. È il problema che un po' è affrontato in tutte le relazioni che mi hanno preceduto nelle aperture. Ecco, io credo che l'Unione Sovietica fosse giunta alla conclusione che nessuno fosse in grado di unificare in l'area, che fosse la storia in questo senso volgesse in direzione dell'Unione Sovietica. E ecco, torno agli anni 50, questa miscela, chiamiamolo così, di messianismo e di estremo pragmatismo, poi emerge un po' da una documentazione degli anni 50 abbastanza ampia, legata agli stenogrammi del Politburo, le memorie molto importanti, ad esempio per il Khrushchev e di Shepilov, eccetera, e via dicendo. Messianismo e pragmatismo, se uno vuole usare una chiave di interpretazione che mi rendo conto è sommaria, unita poi a quella che è dal punto di vista sovietico una certa marginalità del Medio Oriente che resta sino anche durante la guerra dell'Iran Iraq. Qual era la difficoltà? Ora il collega Paolo Soave ha ricordato la Second World War, oggi si parla di New Cold War e ci dimentichiamo che, e ce lo ricordo in documenti, se ne andiamo a leggere sovietici, che la Cold War fu innanzitutto un confronto ideologico, e che andava ai sovietici, Khrushchev, certo, che cito lui, ma pensavano che avrebbe vinto il socialismo, poi invece si trovano di fronte a una realtà che non capiscono, se non altro per la presenza dell'islamismo. L'islamismo l'avevano conosciuto, ma era un islamismo diverso, quello di Sultan Ghaliev, quello degli esperimenti comunisti, quello di Shamil, del combatteo, quello che era stato secolarizzato nel Tatarstan. E l'islamismo che si trovano di fronte nel mondo arabo, Khrushchev lo ripete in continuazione, è un islamismo che non riescono a capire, cioè l'Islam politico, che non riescono a capire la presenza forte dell'Islam politico e non escono fuori, non vedono mai una prospettiva futura, perché poi questo è il problema. Pragmatismo sì, ma negli altri paesi vedono una prospettiva futura. E certo, qui comincia un certo distacco, una certa cautela nei confronti di tutta l'area, poi non sto a andare dietro alla differenziazione legata certo, anche questa è storia nota, la rievoco per comodità di esposizione, e si rendono conto presto si rendono conto che la modernizzazione di stampo sovietico non funzionava, assai prima di quanto poi non accadesse per gli altri paesi. Lo sappiamo ora, negli anni 70 comincia a diventare chiaro a tutti che è una modernizzazione minore, ma nel mondo islamico negli anni 50 cominciano a dirselo anche, questo emerge anche appunto, riferisco ai documenti sovietici, emerge che si rendono conto che quel mondo islamico, più legato a un'idea di comunità, meno legato a un'idea di aggancio all'Occidente, di superamento anche in fondo più legato a un'idea di società organica, la modernizzazione non funziona. Restava, certo, l'altra risorsa, che era quella della fornitura di armi, e anche qui vengono le repliche della storia nella guerra del 1967, del 73, storia nota, non la racconto e vengo, scruto qualche minuti mi restano. Allora entro finalmente nel merito delle questioni, dicendo che noi dobbiamo tener conto di questa stratificazione della storia che cercherò di sintetizzare attorno a una frase, e cioè alla vigilia della guerra fra Iran e Iraq l'Unione Sovietica, non aveva le risorse, la volontà, le idee per aprire una nuova fase della politica in Medio Oriente. Ancora prima degli accordi di Camp David, che sono stati qui ricordati, a me sembra, no, che avesse adottato una postura essenzialmente difensiva, wait see, questo lo dico in inglese. È importante anche in questo contesto, poi gente che si pone il problema di come lavorare, di colleghi, no? Di come lavorare negli archivi, perché riprendendo un tema, in quali archivi si dovrà andare a cercare in futuro per capire quali erano i processi decisionali sovietici. Paolo Bulter mi scruta perché abbiamo perso molto tempo a cercare di entrare negli archivi sovietici. Io ho iniziato qualche decennio prima di lui. Il mio giudizio di una persona che ha perso tanto tempo negli archivi sovietici, ma qui volevo, e quindi non ero quale, ma qui volevo sottolineare che dagli anni 50 alla fine degli anni 70 i processi decisionali slittano chiaramente, al di là che è vero che ci sono delle lenti poche che non sappiamo, eccetera, dal dipartimento internazionale del CUS, dal Dipartimento delle Relazioni con i Paesi Socialisti, anche dal Ministero degli Esteri al KGB, che è un'altra cosa rispetto a quello che scrivono, si dice Putin è un uomo del KGB. Sì, è un uomo del KGB perché faceva la spia a Dresda, non perché reprimiva. E allora il KGB, e nella persona credo soprattutto di Primakov, che è un nome noto, che è stato un persona importante, eccetera, è quello che tiene i rapporti, sono rapporti personali, e si illude anche di controllare questi rapporti personali. Ma se non dovessi dire in quali archivi dover andare a cercare la metà degli anni 70 per la guerra, che è il tema del nostro, direi gli archivi del KGB, e quindi, come dire, in bocca al lupo a chi si propone questa impresa, perché non credo che sia molto facile. Tra l'altro le memorie che noi abbiamo a disposizione ci presentano una visione eroica del KGB, prima Koff, che non manca di una forte considerazione, mancava di una forte considerazione di se stesso, dice che di solito in realtà la posizione della politica estera sovietica era molto più attendista, e soprattutto nei confronti dell'Iraq. Torno al punto che ho già detto prima, gli up and downs della politica nei confronti dell'Iraq di Saddam hanno sempre sospettato, non solo da un punto di vista strettamente personale, su questo le memorie non solo di prima volta sono ma anche perché non pensavano a Mamiti, all'esperienza di Cassim precedente e via dicendo, lo dicono anche spesso e volentieri, non pensavano davvero che fosse in grado di reggere il potere, di portare avanti il paese. L'unica consolazione in questo contesto era che anche gli americani vengono giudicati in una posizione che è stata un po' sintetizzata dal collega amico Paolo Suave, neither nor. Non riuscivano né a agganciare l'Iran né non riuscivano nemmeno ad agganciare l'Iraq, e queste erano le conclusioni. E allora mi restano 8 minuti, credo, e sono arrivato alla fine da dove dovrei iniziare, cioè parlando della guerra Iran-Iraq, che è una guerra che certamente l'Unione Sovietica non vuole, che cerca di evitare. Condemnment to Repetition recita il titolo di un'opera famosa di Bennett, un'opera famosa per chi si occupa di queste cose, condannati ad aggredire, condannati così, ma in questo caso non è assolutamente vero, giudichi altro se poi c'è qualche riferimento alle cose presenti. La Russia non vuole la guerra. Non vuole la guerra tra due stati che formalmente appartengono al campo anti-imperialista, anche se in modo molto differente. E Primakov sostiene anche che non furono avvertiti, che Saddam aveva assicurato fino all'ultimo che l'ambasciatore sovietico a Baghdad che l'Iraq non aveva attaccato, ma sicuramente dai documenti noti, poi altri potrebbero essere aggiunti, noi sappiamo che questo attacco era previsto da parte dell'Unione Sovietica, sempre perché pensavano che l'Iraq fosse il paese più debole, che avesse tutti gli interessi ad attaccare l'Iran nel momento più forte, nel momento di maggiore debolezza. Poi c'era anche una valutazione di Sadat che è riportata con una citazione, secondo Primakov, Saddam was always sure that everything will solve in his favor, no? E quindi la trattava sempre pensando che poi se la sarebbe cavata. Un tema che mi tocca affrontare è quello della contemporaneità di una guerra con l'Afghanistan che inizia prima e che viene risolta, che insomma ora lo sappiamo, quindi sappiamo un po' di più, e ci entrano in guerra perché è un po' complicato, ma il trio dinamico, Andropov, Ustinov e Gromyko impongono questa volontà e la impongono, ecco la differenza con le cose arabe, dicendo che Amin era, come dire, stava per salire con gli americani perché volevano rifarsi della vicenda dell'Iran, eccetera, è storia nota, ma l'elemento determinante di tutta questa vicenda è che sono i nostri, cioè sono comunisti, non possiamo permetterci di farci allontanare da un paese governato non avevano cercato il colpo di Stato nel 1978, ma poi una volta che c'erano che i comunisti insomma erano fino al regime allargata all'Afghanistan. Per Saddam questo non era assolutamente vero. Per Saddam questo non era assolutamente vero. Saddam non era mai stato considerato dei nostri e da allora quindi l'Unione Sovietica segue, i minuti sono diventati 4:30, una politica, una tattica essenzialmente attendista volta ad impedire che uno dei due vincesse. In realtà non pensano mai seriamente che Saddam possa vincere. Dopo la vicenda di Osirak, che domani sarà tema della relazione, a Mosca cominciano a temere che dopo aver avuto questa lezione Saddam si orienti verso gli Stati Uniti. È Aziz stesso, il ministro degli esteri di Baghdad, che gli avverte nel marzo del 1981 che gli Stati Uniti hanno iniziato la fornitura di armi abbastanza consistente all'Iraq e l'informa della visita di Lansford del 1983, eccetera, e via dicendo. E quindi i sovietici, però, siccome non vogliono nemmeno che l'Iran abbia la meglio, quando nel 1982 cominciano a temere che questo accada, e non importa che Tubek sia represso, cominciano a fornire armi all'Iraq, tenendo i contatti attraverso le ambasciate dell'Est Europa, soprattutto quella ungherese e quella della Germania dell'Est. Ecco altri archivi dove cercare possibilmente, in parte anche c'è già molta roba sul fondo, e tenendo soprattutto i contatti. Saddam veniva considerato interlocutore poco affidabile, tenendo soprattutto i contatti con Aziz, tenendo soprattutto i contatti con la Russia. Ma ripeto, erano abbastanza, non volevano che vincesse, e questo sarebbe importante sapere perché, forse perché temevano una situazione successiva a quella del 2003 di Iran, che è in grado di estendere la sua la sua proiezione al di fuori, alle comunità sciite delle ceremonie. Ma ripeto, qui continuano a pensare che l'Iran comunque sarà un protagonista delle vicende del Medio Oriente, mentre invece non sono sicuri che questo ruolo sarebbe potuto aspettare a un'Iran sconfitta. Da questo punto di vista concludo così: la fine della guerra, vista da Mosca, da una Mosca assorbita da ben altri problemi, è un evento, per quel che riesco a capire, assolutamente secondario. La resa dei conti arriva dopo, quando Saddam sempre più incontrollabile, invade il Kuwait, arriva fra il 1990 e il 91, e qui la vicenda è abbastanza nota. Mosca non riesce né a fermare un alleato, mettiamo il termine tra virgolette, che stava facendo una mossa suicida, né riesce a fermare gli Stati Uniti, che gli promettono di non attaccare, poi fanno la guerra tale in una settimana, forse la prima guerra moderna combattuta, nuova rispetto alla seconda guerra mondiale, combattuta così, e lì è l'approdo di una pluridecennale parabola politica, è l'uscita dell'Unione Sovietica dal Medio Oriente, perché si dimostra che anche appunto non controlla gli alleati, le armi che ha a disposizione non riescono a salvare nessuno, e il sostegno militare agli alleati era stata l'arma che aveva permesso all'Unione Sovietica di rimanere nell'area, e quando questo non fu possibile calò la parola fine anche nel mio intervento. Ho addirittura 6 secondi di meno preciso. Grazie per l'attenzione.
Non sei riuscito a aiutare, però la tua memoria.
Okay, thank you very much, Fabio. And our last speaker for this panel is Professor Angela Villani, who is Professor of International History at the University of Messina, Department of Political Science and Law, where she teaches international history and history of international organizations, a subject which she's written a lot about, and which will also be topic of her paper, because as I see from the program, she's going to talk about the United Nations and the Iran-Iraq war. So, Angela, is that 50 minutes?
Thank you to the chair, and many thanks to the organizers of this conference for the invitation, and especially for their warm welcome to Bari. It was a pleasure for me to be here today. My contribution will deal with the role of the United Nations in the Iran-Iraq war, a role that was mentioned by previous speakers. I will try to highlight the main of UN action in trying to find a solution to this conflict through the discussions that took place in the Security Council and General Assembly, as well as through the available memoirs of some of the main actors of the UN Secretariat, and especially the Secretary General Perez de Cuellar and one of the UN officers working for the UN Secretariat, that was Gianluca Pico. Well, in the first part, I will consider the first very long standing phase from the start of the war in 1980 to the wide internationalization of the question in the second half of the decade. This was the longest phase of the war, and it was a phase that showed a substantial inertia on the part of the Security Council, which delegated any attempt of mediation between the parties to the Secretary General. While in the second part I will focus on the crucial 3-year period from 1986 to 1988, which started with the escalation of the war, especially in the Gulf region, and finally led to a solution of the conflict. This solution was possible considering the progressive collaboration between the superpowers and the Security Council and the deeper connection with the Secretary General's initiatives. So, after the outbreak of the war, no country initially requested the Security Council's intervention, and on September 20, 1980, it was the Secretary General Kurt Waldheim who offered these good offices to work for a peaceful settlement of the conflict, and 3 days later, Waldheim himself brought the question to the Security Council. The discussions which followed at the end of September on the Security Council led to the first resolution 479, that called upon Iran and Iraq, so both sides, to refrain immediately from any further use of force and settle their disputes peacefully. No condemnation of Iraq, who started the conflict, we know that it was Iraq that started the conflict, was expressed, nor was any request for withdrawal from Iranian territory. This was a sort of pro-Iraqi attitude, as literature referred to, an attitude that the Security Council and especially the two superpowers maintained until the end of the conflict. This attitude was linked to several elements. As the previous papers have well explained, the two superpowers, for different reasons, looked with varying suspicion to the Iranian Revolution and especially to its consequences in the Middle East. The framework was even more worrying considering the link with other regional crises. I remember the crisis, the conflict in Lebanon, the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, but also the escalation of tension in the Mediterranean after the rise of Gaddafi. This changing in regional balances went beyond the dynamics of the Cold War and certainly conditioned the action of the Security Council on the superpowers in this attitude during the discussion on the question. What influenced the Security Council attitude from the outset was also the question of the hostages at the US Embassy in Tehran. Paolo Sava had already mentioned this question. That was still ongoing during the 1980s. The Security Council had in fact discussed that question in early 1980, with US asking for economic sanctions against Tehran, blocked by the Soviet veto, but a sort of wide image of the anti-Iranian campaign in the US were supporting that moment. With the strong support also of the Arab countries, with the exception, of course, of Libya and Syria, and then with a wide but not unanimous support of the non-aligned movement, and though more cautious at its Western allies, wished to keep a more balanced position between the parties, and since the beginning would prefer a UN intervention as more neutral. So in this framework, the UN maintained contact with both sides since the beginning, the Secretary General. First with Van Dijk, and then from 1982 with Perez de Cuellar. They began a constant dialogue with the parties and addressed a series of mediation proposals to them. Also through the action of two special representatives, Olof Palme, the Swedish Prime Minister, who held this role until 1986, and then Gian Domenico Pico from 1987. So, during the first 6 years of the war, the Secretary General's attempts lacked the Security Council's effective support and did not lead to any concrete results. We can say that as long as the war did not affect Western interests and the war was useful in containing, in certain sense, the expansion of the Iranian revolution, no major initiatives were taken. Moreover, we have to consider the conditions of UN in that moment. A situation that was conditioned by its financial crisis. It went on the brink of bankruptcy in the early 1980s, especially due to the US drastic cutting of its contribution to the UN budget. And we have to remember also the mistrust of the Reagan administration expressed against UN, especially considering the many UN resolutions condemning South Africa and Israel from the 70s to the 80s. So in the case of the Iran-Iraq war, UN succeeded in achieving one major outcome that was a sort of, it was to maintain a balanced position between the two parties and presented itself, the Secretary General presented himself as a super parties actor, so putting in action some confidence-building measures which laid the groundwork for further diplomatic action in the late 80s. In this sense, the Secretary General was also able to manage some missions in the field of various aspects that emerged during the conflict, especially on humanitarian level. And up to 1986, the Security Council met constantly, first and foremost at the request of the Gulf monarchies, and decided 6 resolutions asking for practically the same requests: the immediate ceasefires, the withdrawal from the territories, the respect for freedom of navigation in the Gulf, and then the mediation of the Secretary General. So again, no condemnation against Iraq aggression was present in each of these texts. But notwithstanding this prevailing approach, in the General Assembly debate in September 1982, and then 2 years later in the same general debate, some different views arose asking the UN to take a more balanced position. It was the case, for example, of some Latin American countries with a strong anti-US position, I mean Cuba or Nicaragua, or some African countries involved in the conflict against South Africa. I can mention Zimbabwe and Zambia, for example, and some Asian countries, particularly worried about the situation between Iran and Iraq. That was, for example, India and Pakistan. During the following 2 years, the debate revolved around the same stances, and when another 2 key issues entered the debate, the question of the condition of civilian population and the use of chemical weapons, the situation didn't change. Both the Security Council and General Assembly in autumn 1984 expressed condemnation for the use of chemical weapons according to international law, but no reference was made to Iraq's responsibility in using them, as Paolo Suave said before. Despite its importance, the question of the use of chemical weapons took a second place during the discussion in the Security Council and the following years. The most space was given to the question of the freedom of navigation in the Gulf, with a sort of reciprocal attack between the US and the Soviet Union, according to a sort of Cold War dialectic. As in the previous 2 years, some different positions emerged again, both in Security Council and General Assembly discussions. India, for example, that asked for a more balanced position, and Nicaragua, who accused the US of their mining of its own ports, claiming for the validity of the principle of free navigation for all states, for all countries. In all this framework, Perez de Cuéllar's proposals found little room. Even his trip to the Gulf region in March 1985 to find a consensus of another proposal was also a failure. Did not prevent the further escalation of the war in 1986. Perez de Cuéllar was aware, as he wrote in his memoirs, that the 5 permanent members, while supporting repeated resolutions calling to stop the conflict, were instead contributing to a prolongation of the war, for example, by providing military supplies, in the case of France in 1996 through Iran, or the US responsibility in the Iran Gate. Perez de Cuéllar was also aware that the UN role was essential but not decisive, as it depended on the agreement between the superpowers and more broadly on the cooperation among the 5 permanent members in the Security Council. So this perspective began to open up in 1986 when the discussion in the Security Council took place in a more cooperative climate. For the first time from the start of the war, the Soviet Union did not attack the US for its imperialistic purposes, and while the main attacks against the US and the Gulf states and Israel came from Libya and PLO, who were invited to participate to the discussion of the Security Council in February. While the Soviet representative underlined instead the need to respect international law and referred to the UN for the first time as a tool to manage international security, according to a mindset that was shown at the first summit with the US at Reykjavik in October 1986. What about the US position? Well, despite the still ongoing attacks against the Iranian government and the escalation against terrorist regimes in Libya, for example, first of all, also the Reagan administration was open to this new cooperative mood of the Soviet Union, but unlike the Soviet Union, it did not leave aside the Cold War approach, nor did it advocate a strong role for the UN, influenced by strong criticism from the US Congress and the General Mistrust I had referred before. Finally, the position of China. For the first time, China gave a broader and more articulated speech in 1986, abandoning the rhetoric of solidarity and friendship among third world countries and asking rather for a stronger UN role and respect for international law. So this new climate paved the way for new collaboration between the Security Council, and at the beginning of 1986, with a new mandate, Perez de Cuéllar invited the permanent members and the President of the Security Council to the so-called meeting of the minds at the UN headquarters in New York, trying to break the impasse and draw up a proposal which would be useful to address some of the Iranian requests. So with this aim, Perez de Cuéllar and Pico visited also Moscow and found an outstanding welcome from Gorbachev in June and Shevardnadze in June 1987. We said in their view, as Perez de Cuéllar remembered, the end of the Cold War divide was more feasible for the USSR if it came about through recognition of the UN role. The same view was expressed by Shevardnadze in the General Assembly debate in 1987, and then 1 year later by Gorbachev in the General Assembly, when he proposed the establishment of the so-called comprehensive system of peace and security, so the multi-level plan to be implemented under the aegis of the UN for disarmament and the establishment of a new economic order. So the convergence of position led to the resolution already mentioned also by Federico Scarano, the resolution 5998 in 1987, a peace plan drawn up by Perez de Cuellar and unanimously adopted. It contains some elements that could meet some of the original Iranian requests. First of all, the creation of an impartial body inquiring into the responsibility for the conflict and the question to study the study of the question of reconstruction, the post-conflict reconstruction. It also dispatched a UN observer force, already as formal now entrusted by both parties. During the discussion on the draft resolution, we have a strong endorsement by the Soviet representative that point out that the excellent president for giving the Security Council the role of managing a solution to end the conflict in various areas. Yes, certainly in the Middle East, but also in Central Asia and Southern Africa. On the other hand, US and UK, with Schultz and Jeffrey O, for the first time referred to the use of chemical weapons as a threat to international security, though continuing to consider Iran a terrorist regime as a supporter of terrorism. So, other members of the Security Council, the non-permanent members, we can mention Japan, West Germany, and Italy, sided with this position and strongly supported the solution of the conflict under the aegis of the UN. Just a few words about Italy, for example. Andreotti was the representative in the Security Council during this discussion. He supported the role of the UN in solving this conflict as it had aimed at maintaining a balanced position between the parties in line with its Arab politics, that Riccardo had referred to before. And he appreciated the draft resolution as it considered also the need for post-conflict reconstruction that was very important according to the Italian view and interest. So the following steps were the implementation of the resolution that Iran accepted finally in July 1988, and after another phase of threats by Perez de Cuellar and Domenico Picco to Tehran and Baghdad, and then with the creation of UN, Iran-Iraq Military Observer Group, that was to remain in place until February 1991. My conclusion about this United Nations roles is remembering the word of Perez de Cuellar, who said that in the end it was the United Nations that was strengthened by the Iran-Iraq experience. Maybe he refers to the possibility, to the chance for UN to achieve other important outcomes after the end of the war, like the successful initiative to free the US hostages in Lebanon through Iranian mediation soon after the end of the conflict, or the capability to improve in a certain way its role in conflict management. We have to remember that between 1988 and 1989, the UN set up other 5 peacekeeping activities, operations, to support, for example, the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, in Angola, in Namibia, to supervise Namibia's transition from South African trusteeship to independence, and then also in Central Africa, in Central America, sorry. All this was possible due to a new attitude on the part of the Security Council, who passed from competition to cooperation and began to work together, starting to consider the UN as a place, like a tool also to manage international security. And it was a view that matched with the Soviet aims, as well as with the forthcoming Bush administration's idea of the New World Order. So the solution of the Iran-Iraq war and the role of the UN in the late 80s could be considered as the first evidence of a return to the UN in recognition of its role in managing international peace and security, so between the end of the Cold War and the new challenges of conflict management. The that UN was to face during the 90s, starting with the first case that was the Darfur in the early 90s. Thank you.
Angela, for perfect timing. And now I think I've been instructed to open the floor to questions from the audience. So please raise your hand and introduce yourself if you wish to ask questions to the panelists. Who wants to get started? Please don't be shy. Okay. Professor Garavini.
Giuliano Garavini from the Università Roma 3. So I have a very vague question since I'm the one who breaks the ice. I must admit that the Iran-Iraq war to me is one of the most incomprehensible conflicts from so many different perspectives. But I have a specific question on the issue of the view of the conflict from the Soviet Union and the one from the US. So Professor Bettamin argued that when viewed from the if I'm not mistaken, when viewed from the Soviet perspective, basically ideology came first. So the reading of the position of the Soviet Union should be that the Soviet Union would support a regime that, broadly speaking, from an ideological point of view, from the way the state and the economy is organized, could be, broadly speaking, more similar to the Soviet Union. So my question is that correct or not? Is that the key reason why the Soviet Union sided with Iraq? Is ideology the explanation? And when it comes to the United States, which broadly speaking has a very incomprehensible, in general, I think, role in the Persian Gulf or in the Arab Gulf, depending from which point of view you want to look at it. If you look at that war from an ideological point of view, you have two governments that, in a way, they don't. None of them is an ideological friend of the United States. So, I mean, you made a long presentation. So, if you had to cut it in just a very short answer, what would be the driving force of the foreign policy of the United States in that conflict? Because from what you say, it seems that the driving force is equilibrium. So in a way, to avoid that one of the two sides clearly prevails over the other one, or is there another driving force of the U.S. foreign policy in the conflict?
Okay, should we collect other questions or let the speakers reply? Any instructions from the organizers? No, my choice? Okay, so the speakers then.
Yes, ideology. I think that ideology was the first asset of solid policy in the Middle East in the 1950s and the 1960s. I couldn't fix clear watershed. If there was one, was the death of Sadat, of Nasser, excuse me. after I think that the consideration of power came first, and they supported me in my interpretation as far as I understand, because I must add this. They supported Iraq because they rightly considered it the weaker side in this incomprehensible fight. They supported Iraq. It's a strange story. I have synthesized in a bad way, maybe, but they supported it not because they considered it a friendly state, but because they also feared that there could be something they could be helped by the Americans. They never thought this of Iran. After the experience of the Shah, I come back to my Egypt. There was a long parenthesis, if you want, of the Shah, Mohammed, but after that, I think also now they consider again the Iran an old empire. And the old empire don't sell themselves. So they were sure that the state, the United States, will never enter the Iranian politics. In my opinion, it answer to your question. Okay?
Thank you, Giuliano, for your question. Giving me a chance for synthesizing again my intervention. Well, I would say that if you want to understand U.S. approach to the entire Middle East area, not only the Persian Gulf, not only Iran-Iraq War, I could conclude that the pragmatic approach gives us some good chance to really understand what was the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Otherwise, we have a lot of difficulties. In this question, we can find that the pragmatic approach really included all the key factors of Western interest in the area. So, securing energy supplies, the question of containing Iran as something different for the Islamic Revolution, the fact that also Iraq was not so friendly with the Western Bloc, potential Soviet influence. We are still, as we said before, in the late Cold War or Second Cold War. So to me, the real common point is this pragmatic approach. I would say that it was not so fully successful, okay, but at the same time, USA went beyond the war, really containing costs of that war. So in general terms, we can find that U.S. position was quite incomprehensible, as you said, and I agree with you. But we can find also that in this pragmatic approach, we can find other main issues. For instance, the question of hostages that raises the question of the broader question of human rights that was common in cartels and in Reagan administration. Both of them having this kind of problem. The strategic problem, also trying to improve relations with something that USA was not able to understand. I can quote something about this. Charles Kogan, a CIA veteran, said soon after the outbreak of hostilities between Iraq and Iran that the Islamic Revolution came as a big shock to the US. We didn't expect it, and we didn't know what to do about it. We didn't know what was happening. This was a new phenomenon. The US had in all but name been at war with Iran since the hostages were seized. It was simply a fact. Iran had no friends at the time, anywhere, least of all in the West. And it was almost the same thing for Saddam Hussein regime. So if you take all these points, different points, maybe the only way to synthesize them in a consistent foreign policy was the pragmatic way. Okay.
Okay. Yes. One or two questions. Anybody else? Should we collect both questions and then let speaker sessions? Okay. Let's move on.
I am Luciano Monzali from the University of Bari. I have a question for Professor Riccardi. I know that you studied a lot Giulio Andreotti, his ideas and his role in Italian foreign policy in the 80s. So he became a foreign minister in 1983 and remains there for many years. And by reading the diaries of Andreotti, I noticed that he had a certain interest toward Iran. Also, you can see that also the Iranian representative tried to build a relation with him in the 80s. Can you tell us something more about the vision of Andreotti of Iran, generally speaking, Italian foreign policy? And I think it's a role that perhaps also after the Iran-Iraq war persisted with this, let's say, connection between Andreotti and the Iranian government. Am I wrong?
Okay, next question. Yes.
Dottor Muccini, Roma Free University. So I have two questions. One for Giuliani. How much the fact that the two superpowers and other countries did not have an interest, a clear interest in supporting one or the other in tender help the work of the United Nations, and how much the United Nations, also in the first years of the war, not only in the second half, so in the late 80s when the relationship between the two superpowers got better, but also in the early 80s, and how much the United Nations how much did the United Nations understand the fact that they have more room in acting beside the cooperation inside the UN institution, because there is not a clear interest in the conflict. So, for example, the United States were not providing weapons to Iran or Iraq, and the same the Soviet Union or other European countries or other interested actors. And my other question is for Professor Bettanin and Professor Soave. How much the regional considerations, how much were the regional considerations important for the Soviet Union and the United States in structuring the position toward the war? For example, in the case of the United States, I think about the fact that if they had helped, really helped, or clearly helped Iraq, that would have upset Israel, for example, or the fact that the Soviet Union was involved in Afghanistan, and for the United States, the fact that the Soviet Union was involved in Afghanistan, and Pakistan was also somehow involved. So it was a very complex regional context. So besides what you've said in your presentation, how much this regional context was taken into consideration by the two brothers? Thank you.
No other questions? Sorry, I have a question. Okay. Oh, sorry, Paolo.
I have a question for Paolo too. I'm Paolo Lucic from l'Orientale University of Naples.
What's your opinion about the U.S. perception of Iran after the revolution? Do you think that the U.S. considered Iran a lost ally, a lost client, or there are some debates about the prospect of re-engaging Iran in a pro-Western security framework in the Gulf? There is some debate within the Carter and also the Reagan administration, I think.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you. Bogdan Živković from the Institute for Balkan Studies in Belgrade, and I just want to ask something to Professor Villani. So as I'm interested in the non-aligned movement, I wanted to ask you, when we look at the activities regarding the Iran-Iraq war in the United Nations, were the non-aligned countries more active on this issue than the two superpowers and two blocs? And were they able to impose their own visions, or the two blocs and the two superpowers were more successful in guiding the dialogue on this issue?
Okay, and now I really do not see any other hands raised, so the word goes back to the panelists. In which order? I think Professor Riccardo is first.
Just to say, la questione, la politica di Andreotti nei confronti dell'Iran, innanzitutto bisogna dire che quando Andreotti arriva, diciamo, alla guida della Farnesina, ha già una lunga esperienza di affari internazionali, sia come Presidente del Consiglio che come Presidente della Commissione Esteri. E la sua ispirazione si fonda soprattutto su quello che dicevo prima, cioè sul parlare con tutti. L'Iran, secondo Andreotti, non è un elemento secondario del sistema, cioè la rivoluzione islamica non ha marginalizzato l'Iran dal sistema, ma ne ha cambiato le caratteristiche. Perché parlare con l'Iran è importante? Uno, per i tradizionali interessi economici che ci sono tra Italia e Iran. Sappiamo per esempio che anche importantissime aziende, la Condotte, per dire, aveva un'importantissima commessa per la costruzione dello scalo petrolifero del Bandar Abbas, esempio. Ma poi c'è un aspetto molto importante nella politica andreottiana, che è quello del Libano. L'Iran è fondamentale per poter influenzare gli sciiti libanesi e arrivare a una stabilizzazione del Libano. In questo senso, per Andreotti è altrettanto importante, e forse direi che Andreotti nella politica estera italiana è quello che inventa i rapporti italo-siriani, che come sappiamo nel corso della guerra Iran-Iraq si rivelano essere dei buoni amici, diciamo, dell'Iran. Ma volevo un attimo, per diciamo, concludere questo discorso, dire che il problema della guerra Iran-Iraq è molto importante, soprattutto perché i politici italiani e Andreotti soprattutto temono che questo conflitto produca una spaccatura verticale, cito, spaccatura verticale del mondo arabo. Siria, Libano, Libia, Algeria, Yemen del Sud, Organizzazione della Liberazione della Palestina, sostenuti dall'Unione Sovietica dalla parte dell'Iran. E poi i filo-iracheni, che poi non sono nemmeno tanto amici dell'Iraq. Ecco, quindi si teme questa spaccatura, perché questa spaccatura potrebbe produrre alla fine una impossibilità di trovare una soluzione, anche parziale. Quindi Andreotti insiste nell'evitare la demonizzazione dell'Iran, che, come ha spiegato benissimo il professor Milano nel suo libro, è uno, invece, d'altra parte, uno dei tentativi che gli Stati Uniti fanno presso le diplomazie europee e occidentali per cercare di uniformare, diciamo, questo atteggiamento. Quindi, diciamo, un'altra cosa importante di Andreotti è evitare di uniformare la politica estera italiana in nome non di un'ideologia anti-americana, ma in nome di interessi italiani precipui alla politica estera americana.
Grazie Luca. The next question was from Giordano Vicini to Angela Villani and then to Paolo Sarone and from the
the first one was about the interest of the two superpowers to take side or not to take side.
How that helped the United Nations?
Yeah. I think that this interest, not to take side, not to maintain a strong position, especially at the beginning of the discussions, was linked to the idea that the Iranian revolution, maybe the international community didn't know that the Iranian revolution will really succeed and stabilize the Iranian government, the Iranian force, the revolutionary force in Iran. So maybe it is after the 1982 when the revolution established and strengthened the interior part of the countries, since then a sort of new military escalation that put Iran ahead of Iraq in the conflict. Maybe the two superpowers had some difficulties to maintain this sort of we can say neutral position, but in the discussion the position is not so neutral because they are so interested in underlying the position of Gulf monarchies, balances in the Gulf, so the situation involving Iraq especially, then in underlying for example, the consequences of conflict on Iranian population, whose conditions were very tragic, as the Secretary General reported to the Security Council many times, not only for the use of chemical weapons, but also for the attacks, the bombing of the cities. So maybe the idea that I had reading the discussion was that they use, in a certain sense, this delegation to the UN Secretary General as a sort of tool to maintain super partes position that was not a real super partes, but was a sort of lack of real interest in solving the war. So, and this is clearly witnessed by their continuing assistance, military assistance to Iraq. That is a fact. Both the USSR and the US maintaining this assistance during the war, as well as some important European countries like France, for example, but many others. So about UN mediation role, I think that maybe the major result of UN Secretariat was to maintain a sort of personal diplomacy, direct links with parties. This was a sort of confidence measures that was so important in the last part of the conflict, but especially was a sort of opportunity, chance to build, to shape a role for UN in this moment. It was linked to the direct intervention of Persian, especially, and the officials at the UN Secretariat. Gian Domenico Pico, but also, for example, Iqbal Riza, the Pakistan officer who drew a lot of proposals or mediation with Iraq. However, nothing can happen without the Security Council collaboration. So, from one perspective, we can say that this was a great chance for UN in improving its diplomacy, direct diplomacy, while this is an example of the fact that nothing can happen without a deep collaboration with the Security Council. So, and in fact, since the Security Council started to collaborate with these officials, UN officials, the situation will move to an unlock. Maybe I can answer to the question of the non-aligned movement. In lots of draft resolution, the non-aligned movement was one of the main sponsors, together with the Arab League and the Gulf monarchies in the first as well in the second big phase of the conflict. Moreover, the non-aligned movement as an organization, as association, a big association, carried out several attempts of mediation between the parties. But in general, there is a sort of dynamic within the movement that divided that show a sort of difference among its members, especially a difference because more radical ones, I mentioned Cuba and Nicaragua, but they were so in the front line of an anti-US position, but also the very worried Asian countries. I mentioned India and Pakistan, but also Bangladesh, Malaysia, Indonesia. So Asian countries that are so worried about the consequences of this war for their countries, for ethnical and religious consequences as well as for political balances. So I think that the dynamic within the non-aligned movement are strongly dependent also on the Cold War divide in this moment.
And I think Professor Zohar both have...
Yes, I think that the Kremlin realized that after the ousting of Khrushchev, that USA was the stronger side in the Middle East, realized, at least the specialists, the staff, political staff, the Institute of Oriental Studies, that the professor, I think, know much better than me, could say, beware, they are the stronger side. They never wanted war, by the way, nor in the 1967, yes, not after the 1973. They never wanted war. They tried to avoid it because they were aware that they were the weakest side. But I think, maybe I'm wrong, but I think really that they never thought that USA could have the upper hand in the Middle East. And they found, the Soviets, found a good cause, but only in the 1970s, supporting the Palestinians. Because it was a good instrument to organize all the Arab world around the Soviet Union. And they never thought that the United States had the upper and also because, not only Andreotti, also the Kremlin were sure that without Iran there couldn't be a stabilization of the Middle East. And since the beginning of the conflict between Iraq and Iran, we saw that they were sure that the United States were unable, would be unable, to organize the Middle East. This is what was the watershed? I think that Angela Milano remembered it, speaking of the resolution of ONU 1987, when the Soviet Union, with all its troubles, tried to solve the problem of the Middle East, cooperating with the United States. There was no way to do cooperation. The United States did alone. The story is well known.
No, sorry, just to say what you're right. There is a connection between the position of Andreotti and the position of the USSR. There is also not, I couldn't say a permanent consultation between Moscow and Rome, but there is, I could say, an harmony of evaluation of the situation about not all the Middle East, but some part of the Middle East. For example, in Lebanon, no, but in Syria, yes. So,
thank you, and Aldo, you're next.
Thank you, Bob, Giordana, and Paolo, for your interesting question. So, first, what about regional approach? It was very hard. Just trying to combine the same consistent strategy, different allies with different interests. Just an example, Israel was so relevant and was really a pivotal factor in promoting a kind of strategic compensation in favor of terror, which eventually culminated the so sadly famous Iran-Contras affair. As Israel was, for the very first moment of the war against Baghdad, even before, if you consider the attack to the Iraq facilities with Iraqi nuclear project. Then USA tried to involve also Saudi Arabia when Saudi Arabia was involved in lowering oil prices and causing a dramatic loss of oil revenues for both Baghdad and Tehran. So different moments, different strategies, always the same, to me at least, if I'm not wrong, pragmatic approach, choosing according to the necessities, different partners, different allies. Yes, I have to admit it was very difficult, quite impossible to be consistent, both for Carter and Reagan administration. However, if you take under consideration the final outcome, as I said before, for war aims it was quite good. Not so for political aims, but I have to conclude that political aims were secondary in U.S. posture towards the Iron Iraq War, to me. Okay? Paolo, yes, I agree with you. The Iranian question was and still remains a never-ending debate in U.S. administrations. Carter, Reagan, but why not, as you know, Obama, Trump, and now Biden, always the same, with a political problem. There's no way approaching Iranian regime in a, how I can say, a positive way, overcoming differences, lack of trust, competition, structural problem. However, an attempt in order to create conditions to pave the way for improvement, a real improvement, was always tried by U.S. foreign policy. That's my very easy and simple conclusion.
Okay, are there any other? Of course.
I just wanted to make a comment about your question or your comment about the war being unfathomable. I think I'm not speaking as somebody who has the experience of the other panelists in terms of foreign policy towards the Iran-Iraq war, but as somebody who perhaps has been, teaching this subject to students who often ask, the same question. And based on the research that I've had to engage with in that process, I think with hindsight, it became apparent that we have to look at the Iran-Iraq war in the context of Arab regional politics, but also the impact that the Islamic Republic and the creation of the Islamic Republic would have in the Persian Gulf region. So you have to take into consideration the fact that Saddam Hussein comes to power and his competing ideology about Baathism with that of Assad, and that also competes with Saudi Arabia in terms of what kind of Arabness you should have as the most legitimate Arabness in the region. And then with the Islamic Republic, obviously not an Arab country, but you have that threatening or an alternative way of legitimizing politics in the region in a very post-colonial dynamic. So I think that's very difficult because we often, for external actors, it's put forward. I think you might see the region in terms of pro-Western or pro-Soviet, but I think actually you have to look at the region in terms of those post-colonial governments, post-imperial governments who are trying to forge their position in the world, but also in the region. And therefore, it's not a simple black and white of imperialism or anti-imperialism.
Thank you so much. Yes. Okay.
Thank you for your comments. May I go through on the points? Because it seems to me that the ideological lens to understand the Iran-Iraq war doesn't work, but in general, it doesn't work to understand the complex politics of the so-called Middle East. In my opinion, this is not my opinion, it's based on the reading that I had, the Cold War dialectics, more than internal ideology, worked in Middle East for a certain time lapse. Let's say, I think from the Eisenhower Doctrine up to the Yom Kippur Ramadan war. After it, for a complex of reasons, it doesn't work no more. But in particular, the ideology, if I can resume the thread of before. If you look in the by the perspective of the Soviet Union, it seems to me that the choice of Soviet Union wasn't to work on the basis of ideological proximity. Conversely, Soviet Union supported, since the times of the late Stalin, okay, no problem, but yeah, when the Soviet Union decided to endorse Nasser, which was, not only Nasser wasn't communist, of course, but it was anti-communist. Nasser struck the Egyptian Communist Party. There is a wonderful book of some decades ago on this topic, and it was the Egyptian was the first case. Iraq was the second one, of course, in the frame of the Khrushchev politics that it was very more dynamic and struck more success in Middle East than Khrushchev. And in particular, the Iraqi coup of '58 was a success for the Soviet Union, and in this case, the Iraqi Communist Party played a fundamental role in the coup. But after it, when the Ba'ath, with the Ba'ath takeover, the same Communist Party was almost exterminated by the Baathists and, moreover, by Saddam. So this didn't change the complex of the interplay in the Middle East. The disruptive event, in my opinion, is the Islamic Revolution. It is a game changer because the Islamic Revolution has a precise. The Islamic Revolution was against the same Cold War dialectic. Also, of the second Cold War, that is were more fluid for their actors with respect to the former one, to the second one. And for this reason, I moved to a question to Professor Riccardi, and I moved to Italian, because Professor Riccardi presented in Italian. La questione palestinese chiaramente ha attraversato tutto questo percorso. D'altronde comunque sulla stessa questione araba, diciamo, del conflitto arabo-israeliano, quanto ho cercato di argomentare prima, in un certo senso si è sviluppato, perché non possiamo parlare di affinità preconcette in senso occidentale o a favore del blocco sovietico, né degli israeliani né dei palestinesi, o meglio, se ci fossero, se li andiamo a guardare, vanno contro la vulgata poi attuale, insomma, o quantomeno poi delle scelte politiche, perché comunque sono state fatte in ragione di un confronto regionale che andava al di là. Il punto è la questione appunto che volevo porre, la politica di Andreotti, che giustamente il professor Riccardi menzionava, di parlare con tutti, però quando si verificava il conflitto come quello fra Iraq, perché insomma certamente la postura e i rapporti con l'Iran però non potevano essere considerati secondari rispetto alle relazioni con l'Iraq. Ora io sto pensando a quanto cercherò di presentare domani rispetto alla cooperazione nucleare, che comunque fra Iraq e l'Italia c'era, era stata in un certo senso rilevante. A un certo punto, quando le parti sono in conflitto, parlare con tutti presenta oggettivamente dei problemi. Però la questione, la domanda è questa, e mi collego appunto anche a quanto appunto ci ha riportato Paolo Soa, in particolare col passaggio dello scandalo Iran Gate, e quindi con questa posizione degli Stati Uniti che a un certo punto verifica un cortocircuito, perché l'Iran Gate, peraltro, che per quanto sono rimasto forse un po' indietro sulle fonti, ma c'è un passaggio siriano nell'Iran Gate, cioè sono i siriani che passano al famoso giornale libanese la notizia che fa scoppiare la cosa. Ecco, riuscire a tenere la barra in questa situazione così polarizzata, ma anche così cangiante allo stesso tempo, era un po' problematico. Quindi mi chiedo, questo riuscire a parlare con tutti, forse in quel periodo magari ecco, si parla un po' meno con tutti in quel periodo là, in quel frangente là, prima di una ripresa anche del cavo.
Molto evidente, la politica del parlare con tutti è ereditata da Andreotti a livello governativo, diciamo, e per quanto riguarda la guerra in Iraq è vero, incontra alcune difficoltà, nel senso che dico cose che sono già state scritte da altri molto meglio di quello che io potrei dire. Rosario Milano nel suo volume ci spiega come l'idea di una equidistanza italiana tra Iran e Iraq in realtà è un'equidistanza, come anche tu adesso dicevi, molto ravvicinata all'Iraq. Non di meno però i rapporti con l'Iran non si interrompono, ecco, appunto, questo, insisto su questo. Però anche gli stessi, le difficoltà ci stanno, e le difficoltà emergono soprattutto dall'andamento della guerra. Cioè, quando l'Iraq è profondamente in difficoltà, a un certo punto l'Italia rivendica la propria neutralità, e quello a un certo punto gli iracheni gli dicono: sì, voi siete neutrali, ma state attenti che a essere troppo neutrali si finisce per essere parziali. Quindi qui c'è anche un altro problema. I problemi sono esogeni alla linea politica italiana, cioè vengono dalla situazione bellica sul campo, e questo naturalmente mette in difficoltà l'Italia. Nel complesso però devo dire che alla fine, per quel poco che mi è capitato di leggere, direi che alla fine l'Italia da questo conflitto, la linea politica, diciamo, del parlare con tutti, quella che io ho definito forse molto approssimativamente, del parlare con tutti, alla fine ne esce, diciamo, tutto sommato non male, ecco, insomma, cioè l'Italia riesce a mantenere quella posizione, come dicevo all'inizio, di posizione di potenza, media potenza, saggia e ragionevole, che diciamo è poi stato il suo marchio di fabbrica negli anni 80.
Si escono peggio quei pasticcioni di Langheri, come Andreotti chiamò quella parte del governo.
I must exert my power as chairman of the session to bring it to an end. I have been reminded by the organizers that we are entitled to a very short pause, because then we have to come back here for the keynote speech. So I would suggest, with the approval of the organizers, that we have a 10 minutes break, and we let's 5 minutes. Okay, let's say we resume our work at 6. Okay, thanks everybody.
Not so hard.
Una forma di artificial intelligence.
Io non so se ho risposto.
Assolutamente, no,
non è conflitto grande.
Questa è una prospettiva interessantissima pensare al fatto che
ti fa anche da ponte da parte quando non sapete fare le commissioni dagli spazi a tutte le creazioni questa è una delle
sì, anche questo fatto che insomma già negli anni 80 comincia a riprendere più un po' sul ruolo
una specie di palestra
e lo fatto
Professore, non salutare.
come stai?
Io benissimo. Grande
alla fine mi sono conosciuto
un documentario sulle voci anche
Allora, questo tema in realtà c'è un castello quasi oggi stasera, io non ce lo posso prendere via.
Senti, lo vedo, sì,
poi però mi racconto, fanno vedere
sì, sulle missili
sono militari,
tutti che ci guardavamo un po'.
Pakistan gioca un po' d'azzardo, vince su tutta la linea.
Sì, però una cosa così, secondo me quando lo vedo sul partito hanno un'idea di partito, non credono nemmeno hanno un'idea di partito dove al bar. No, sì, forse sì, ma non credo nel cioè, a un certo punto non credo. Sì, seconda cosa che sono stato Sì, però uno scontro lì hanno questo è
però
non hanno lo conoscevo, lo sapevo che gli erano degli veglietti, un po' della scena. Il
però la Europa preparata
il problema principale è che l'industria militare non era mi viene pensato che l'italiano c'è raccontato però lui non ci ha mai raccontato perché comunque storicamente non era questo non l'ho studiato ancora sì,
poi la parte
let me inquire with what time we have if there is a time we have to make the room. Sì, ho sentito troppe volte però è vero
back to work
di prendersi lo scelta alla RAB
la formazione breve
tanto dopo
started right away with our keynote speaker, so I will keep my remarks very brief. Great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Shabnam Holiday, who is Associate Professor in International Relations in the School of Society and Culture at the University of Plymouth. She's also the current director of the Modern Research Program at the British Institute of Persian Studies. Publications include Defining Iran, Populism, the International and Methodological Nationalism, Global Order and the Iran-Israel Nexus, published in Political Studies in 2020, and The Legacy of Subalternity and Gramsci's National Populist Discourse in the Case of the Islamic Republic of Iran, published in Third World Quarterly in 2016. And Professor Holiday will talk to us about the legacy of the Iran-Iraq War in Iranian foreign policy, legitimacy, sovereignty, and world order. Professor Holiday, yours, welcome, and it's a great pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Is that okay? The sound's okay?
Yes.
Yes. I'd like to take this opportunity, first of all, to thank Siavosh, Branch Daimi, Professor Luciano Manzali and Rosario Milano for organising, and the organising committee for inviting me to take part. I've had such a lovely warm welcome and with great food already. I'm very happy to be here and I look forward to further collaborations. I'd also like to say in my role as BIPS how happy we are to be able to take this opportunity to contribute to facilitating the conference. Revisiting the Iran-Iraq War is also very important as it is a war that is often forgotten in the field of international relations or IR and beyond. And as Professor Luciano has already eloquently addressed this and its significance. Today my presentation is not from the perspective of a historian, rather as somebody working in international relations. Before starting with the main content of the paper and exploring the legacy of the Iran-Iraq War on the Islamic Republic of Iran's foreign policy, I would like to say two things about my approach to IR, and then a couple of things about the research context for today's paper, which is very much work in progress. The first thing I would like to say about IR is to highlight global IR, which echoes the debates in global history. In 2014, Amitav Acharya put forward the Global IR project, which involves the grounding of IR in world history, not just Greco-Roman, European or US history, integrating area studies and recognizing multiple forms of agency, and moving beyond the dichotomization of West versus the rest, and it's this last one that I'm most interested in. This was in response to and part of a long-standing debate on the Eurocentric nature and roots of international relations, and its failure to include and or appreciate the complexity of the so-called non-West. In my view, this is all the more important in the case of actors that are largely considered the other in global politics and the discipline itself. The static approach in US foreign policy in particular toward Iran has been well researched. Although we also have to appreciate that the US is not a static or monolithic actor either. The implication in static approaches is that Iran is always put forward as the rogue other that is fundamentally different to yet benign forever self. This is both the case of IR and foreign policy. So, in my view, global IR has legitimized the inclusion of the other in all its complexity into the discipline. The second thing I would like to say about IR is to highlight international historical sociology. In my work, an appreciation of the complexity of politics is facilitated by drawing on debates in international historical sociology. This is a subdiscipline of IR that brings together historical sociology and the study of the international. In terms of its contribution to IR, its aims are to highlight the sociological influences on the international, such as foreign policy. Consequently, it highlights interconnectedness between domestic and international, or internal and external factors. That is, domestic politics on the one hand, and foreign policy or international dynamics such as imperialism, colonialism, ideas of world order, and global neoliberalism on the other. In the case of the Islamic Republic of Iran, an international historical sociology approach seeks to demonstrate how the very idea of the Islamic Republic is simultaneously to do with domestic and international factors. It is both a structure and ideology for domestic political order. It also has anti-imperialism at its heart and has its own views about regional and world order, and of course, Islam is transnational. International historical sociology also aims to highlight the need to bring history back into IR. Thus, the historical context is essential to any exploration of foreign policy, imperialism, colonialism, etc. Now to say something about research context. Today's paper is part of a wider research project examining how Iran relates to the notion of world order. Part of this is a paper on former President Hassan Rouhani's construction of the US and during the Trump presidency, and I draw on this to a certain extent today. Borrowing from Ernesto Leclerc and Chantal Mousse discourse theory, I have examined world order through a discourse analysis of Rouhani's texts. Discourse theory provides appropriate tools that simultaneously exemplifies the constructed nature of world order, the process of creating a threatening and rogue other, and power relations in the international system. I argue that Rouhani constructs Trump in terms of norms and values associated with rogue state status. Simultaneously, Rouhani constructs Iran as being faithful to norms and values associated with the idea of a Western liberal world order. This is done by equating the Islamic Republic to multilateralism and being faithful to the rule of international law and peace and stability, while Trump is equated with values associated with rogue states, such as terrorism, not being faithful to the rule of law, and jeopardizing security in the region. This process, as far as the Islamic Republic is concerned, in turn delegitimizes the US and legitimizes Iran in the international system. Importantly, in this case, I focus specifically on Trump's withdrawal of the JCPOA and the moving of the US Embassy to Jerusalem. This research builds on long-term discourse analysis of Islamic Republic of Iran elites. In this case, however, the focus is Rouhani, and today's paper continues to focus on Rouhani. Although the Islamic Republic is a multi-institutional government with varied political stances, and despite the supreme leader being the head of state, the president represents Iran's portrayal of itself to the world. I will now turn to my argument regarding the legacy of Iran-Iraq war in Rouhani's foreign policy. As we know, the Iran-Iraq war played an essential role in the preservation of the very idea and institutions of the Islamic Republic of Iran. While this is not the focus of my paper, we should bear in mind the legacy of the experience of the Iran-Iraq war also needs to be seen in terms of the renewal of Iranian as opposed to Islamic identity following the establishment of the Islamic Republic, the intellectual development and reforms that, as Ali Ansari and others have discussed in their work, and the significant role of the IRGC. As has been well documented, the experience of the Iran-Iraq war also further legitimized Ayatollah Khomeini's narrative regarding the world in terms of the oppressor versus the oppressed. Crucially, in the eyes of the Islamic Republic, the Iran-Iraq war provided further evidence of global arrogance in terms of domination or hegemony in form of the East and the West. It also proved that there was a conspiracy of the oppressor against the idea of the Islamic Revolution and the subsequent Islamic Republic. Today, my contention is that this narrative, which is the legacy of the Iran-Iraq war, continues to play an essential role in the preservation of the very idea of the Islamic Republic. It is also used to legitimize Iran's positions and actions in the region and its rightful place as the defender of the oppressed, because Iran has survived the aggression of the oppressor or oppressors. So the past and specific time and place is mobilized and remembered to frame the present, and subsequently legitimize the Islamic Republic. Sovereignty is integral to this. Not only is the sovereignty of Iran at the heart of Iranian foreign policy, but also essentially sovereignty of the region, which in the case of the Islamic Republic and the Rouhani texts I've looked at, is the Arab world and Afghanistan. Thus, the Iran-Iraq war is crucial to appreciating the Islamic Republic's self-perception in terms of defense. This defense is in relation to actors that are constructed in terms of conspiracy, arrogance, sedition, oppression, and imposition of violence. Indeed, Rouhani's texts are replete with these terms. It should be noted, however, this can be fluid depending on the circumstances at the time. In addition to the legacy of the Iran-Iraq War, however, this process of legitimization and maintaining sovereignty takes place in the context of global dynamics that can be seen in terms of world order. By this I mean not only who is included or excluded from Western liberal world order, but also who rejects a Western-led world order. Maintaining Iran's sovereignty also takes place in a context whereby the Islamic Republic needs to continuously maintain its legitimacy as the most appropriate defender of the oppressed, not only to an international context, but crucially to a domestic audience. Thus, not only must contemporary foreign policy be seen in a historic context, but also in one that appreciates the interconnectedness of domestic and international politics and dynamics. Finally, regional context, as I will highlight later, needs to be acknowledged. We should bear in mind that the 2003 Iraq War and the subsequent removal of Saddam Hussein and the rise of Islamic State or Daesh need to be seen in a historical context that also goes back to the Iran-Iraq War. In order to highlight this contention, I will first address the notion of world order. I will then go on to Khomeini and his narrative of the sacred defence, followed by Rouhani's texts, which need to be seen in terms of the idea of a rogue state. So what is world order? Intellectual developments, geopolitics and global economics have recently reinvigorated scholarship on the idea of world order in IR. The failure or weakening of the so-called liberal world order has been attributed to the rise of populism in states associated with liberal democracy and the growing influence and significance of illiberal actors such as Russia and China. These debates also include the issue of whether or not there is such a thing as liberal world order that governs the globe. Furthermore, due to the ramifications of the global financial crisis, it has been put forward that there is consensus in IR approaches that the hegemony of liberal order is over. It is in this geopolitical and economic context, as part of debates regarding the prevailing Eurocentrism in IR, that Amitav Acharya's Global IR project has highlighted the need to appreciate agency of all actors in world order construction. While there is an increasing scholarship on the global south, the majority has looked at China and Russia, and little has looked at Iran. World order can be seen in terms of a combination of institutions and ideas that endeavour to govern the international system. It has been defined as the systematic configurations of political authority. However, it is specific norms and values that determine the liberal nature of world order. These are democracy, democratic community, progressive change, collective problem solving, shared sovereignty, rule of law, and multilateralism. Robert Cox highlights the role of institutions and how norms and values are disseminated. For Cox, world order is a social, economic, and political structure that expresses universal norms and mechanisms, laying down general rules of states for those forces of civil society that act across national boundaries. Thus, the ideal world order is one in which embedded norms and laws are transposed onto the international stage through international institutions. For example, the sanctions regimes by the EU, UN, and US before the JCPOA and the role of the IAEA can be seen in terms of the so-called Western liberal world order put into practice. Crucially, drawing from Antonio Gramsci, Cox sees world order in terms of US hegemony. However, this hegemony in Gramscian terms implies that all actors view such a world order as legitimate and have consented to Western or US-led leadership. This is not the case. Not all actors in the international system have consented to US or so-called Western leadership of world order. China and Russia are examples of this. However, it is important not to adopt static approaches. Indeed, the JCPOA is a crucial example of the Islamic Republic of Iran engaging with what is referred to as a Western liberal world order. At the same time, however, Amitav Acharya's approach is convincing. He argues that an American world order is best understood in terms of relationship among a group of like-minded states, mostly Western, led by the US. Therefore, he argues that regional powers are seen as a threat to the so-called American order. We should note, and which has been discussed in great detail this afternoon, that the world order at the time of the Iran-Iraq War was seen as being dominated by the bipolar Cold War between the two superpowers. And of course, Khomeini famously said neither East nor West. So now I'd like to turn to how Khomeini has understood the sacred defence or Iran-Iraq War. As we know, building on the work of Jalal al-Ahmad, Ali Shariati, and leftist and Marxist thought and groups, Khomeini articulated a narrative that would become integral to the Islamic Republic of Iran. This narrative saw the world in terms of oppressed and the oppressors, what was perceived as US hegemony, an extension of which was Zionism, along with the Pahlavi regime, and the rich was considered in terms of the oppressor. Rejection of this global arrogance was reflected in Khomeini's construction of an antagonistic frontier between two camps, the oppressed versus the oppressors. As I will illustrate, this narrative of the oppressed facing the oppressor is very much evident in Rouhani's perception of the region. Also evident are aspects of Khomeini's narrative of the sacred defense. Hadi Abdul-Maliki and Leila Majdani, in a recent article published in the Journal of Contemporary Research on Islamic Revolution, have highlighted Khomeini's reflections on the Iran-Iraq War based on a speech Khomeini gave to scholars of religion on the 22nd of February 1989. And here there's a list that I've taken from their understanding of this text. I would like to draw your attention to a number of these points in particular, because they are echoed in Rouhani's reflection of the sacred defense, and also in relation to more recent dynamics and events, which I will come to later. So these are: Iran is the oppressed in the context of the aggressor's war. The arrogance of the two superpowers was broken. There was need for steadfastness. And finally, brotherhood and patriotism of the people. Also in a recently published article in the International Journal of Political Science in Iran, Dr. Esfandiar highlights the concept of defense in Khomeini's thought. This includes defense against arrogant invasion of oppressed Islamic nations and the denial of domination and hegemony. Now, before moving on to Rouhani, it is necessary to address the notion of Iran as a rogue state, because in addition to the legacy of the Iran-Iraq War, we also need to appreciate that during his second term, Rouhani speaks in the context of Iran being considered as a rogue state by Donald Trump. As I noted earlier, discourse theory provides appropriate tools that simultaneously exemplifies the constructed nature of world order, the process of creating a threatening and rogue other, and power relations in the international system. My contention is that considering the idea of a world order, a Western liberal world order, as a discourse, contributes to a better understanding of power relations in the international system, and more specifically, Iran's view of the world as part of it. The Western liberal world order discourse, and more importantly, who is included and or excluded as a rogue other, is maintained and legitimized by attempting to establish intellectual hegemony. Here, a political frontier is constructed that is maintained through equivalential chains. So while the self, the act associated with the Western liberal order, is equated with liberal norms and values, the other is equated with being a rogue state. Even though the oppressor in Rouhani's discourse is not always the US, Rouhani speaks and acts in an environment of a wider narrative or discourse of world order and Trump's construction of Iran as a rogue state. And so a political frontier is constructed between the US and Iran. But what exactly is the rogue state? Rogue state includes violating selected agreed international norms by engaging in hostile activities, supporting international terrorism, and seeking to acquire weapons of mass destruction. And here I take Wunderlich's work on rogue state status. It is also used in relation to the violation of core norms of the prevailing normative order, combined with a deliberate intent to destabilize or destroy that order. Following the labelling of the Islamic Republic in terms of terrorism, during President Bill Clinton's administration, after the Iran-Iraq War and the subsequent 1991 Gulf War, following Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, the rogue state label was used to refer to Iran, along with North Korea, Libya, Cuba, and indeed Iraq. In 2002, in his State of the Union speech, former US President George W. Bush discursively constructed Iran along with Iraq and North Korea as part of the axis of evil in the context of the War of Terror and the build-up to the 2003 US-led invasion of Iraq. Bush also linked Iran with exporting terror by highlighting the Islamic Republic's relationship with Hamas and Hezbollah as part of what was considered a global network of terrorism. While Barack Obama's presidency saw a warming of Iran-USA relations and the JCPOA, rogue status returned with Trump. In his speech delivered in Saudi Arabia on the 21st of May in 2017, Iran is equated to terrorism. Trump states, "From Lebanon to Iraq to Yemen, Iran funds, arms and trains terrorists, militias and other extremist groups that spread destruction and chaos across the region. For decades, Iran has fueled the fires of sectarian conflict and terror." In a speech on the 13th of October in 2017, Trump referred to Iran as a rogue regime and equated Iran with the sponsorship of terrorism, continuing aggression in the Middle East and all around the world. He goes on to refer to the Iran deal as, I quote, "one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into." By labelling Iran as a rogue regime, Trump has created a political frontier that legitimizes the US and its relationship with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia and former Prime Minister of Israel Benjamin Netanyahu in the international system. On the other side of the frontier is Iran and its allies. I will now turn to Rouhani's perception of the Islamic Republic in relation to the region and how the narrative of the Iran-Iraq war continues to be articulated. By this I mean not only Khomeini's oppressed versus oppressive view of the world, but also Iran's role and position of defence, the ability of the Iranian nation to come together and their steadfastness in the face of the external aggressor and oppressor, and the inability of the arrogance to break the Iranian people no matter what is thrown at them. This analysis is based largely on texts such as speeches and interview transcripts during Trump's administration. So it's not, because I've been focusing specifically in the Trump presidency. In addition to the liberal world order and rogue status dichotomization, these texts must also be seen in the context of complex regional dynamics. In this regard, as I mentioned, Rouhani sees the region as the Arab world and Afghanistan. It is not possible to address this in a lot of detail. However, the issues and factors that are often raised are the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria and Yemen, Israeli occupation of Palestine, the fight against Daesh or Islamic State, Persian Gulf security, and of course Trump's leaving the Iran nuclear deal. In this context, Rouhani constructs the environment in a way that echoes Khomeini's reflections on the experience of the Iran-Iraq war noted above. In this slide, I've given some examples from various texts. We see here that for the Islamic Republic, it is populations that are subject to external aggression rather than internal aggression that are considered as part of the oppressed. We see also the Islamic Republic being constructed in terms of defense of the oppressed who are faced with arrogance. Furthermore, my interpretation of the use of terrorism here is that it refers to groups such as Daesh or other Salafi jihadi groups. As we know, the IRGC played a fundamental role in the fight against Daesh or Islamic State, so here Rouhani, without naming names, is criticising those that have funded or supported such groups in Syria, Lebanon and Iraq. In this slide, I would like to draw your attention to the qualities attributed to those people who are considered the oppressed. Echoing Khomeini's reflection on the ability of the Iranian people to stand up to the oppressor and external aggressor, these texts are examples of the Palestinian people and the Iranian people being equated with unity, steadfastness and resistance. We also see a continuation of those perceived as the oppressor and aggressor. In this case, the US and Zionism being equated with arrogance and conspiracy. Something that I've also begun to notice is the use of the term free. This appears to refer to those who are no longer seen to be in the clutches of the external oppressor or aggressor, such as Iraq following the removal of not only Saddam Hussein, but also after the US-led occupation of Iraq. In Rouhani's text, alongside the discourse of oppressor versus oppressed dichotomization, there is also the rogue state versus Western liberal world order dichotomization. Rouhani systematically equates the US with norms and values associated with rogue state status, such as terrorism and the failure to commit to the rule of law. Iran, on the other hand, is equated with combating terrorism, maintaining peace and stability in the region, and being faithful to the rule of law. This discourse is evident in a series of speeches given just after Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA. Crucially, the Iran-Iraq war is seen as part of other actions and processes by the US against Iran. Within a few days of each other, Rouhani makes 3 speeches reaching 3 different audiences. One is a statement on the 15th of May, the day after the 70th anniversary of the creation of the State of Israel and Nakba. The following day, a statement is made to his cabinet, and 2 days later, a speech is made at an extraordinary meeting of the Organization of Islamic Conference. In the Nakba statement, as it's referred to by Rouhani, Rouhani equates Iran with multilateralism and peaceful defenders of the oppressed Palestinians. The multilateralism is not only in terms of Muslim countries in the region, but also Islamic countries and the morality of the global community. The US, on the other hand, is referred to as the greatest breaker of treaties and international regulations. In the cabinet meeting text, the US is equated with jeopardizing peace and stability in the region and as going against international law. Iran, on the other hand, is equated with being in favour of multilateralism and trustworthiness in relation to international laws. The extraordinary OIC meeting is held to address the crisis in Gaza following the transferring of the US embassy to Jerusalem. Rouhani states that, quote, "The White House showed that it has no fear of destroying the foundations of the rules and laws of international order." He goes on to state, quote, "The new American government poses dangerous threat to the system of international laws and global peace and security." It should be noted, however, that this discourse is being articulated alongside the severe and violent clamping down of its own population and its role in support of the Assad regime against Syrians. Significantly, Trump's actions are placed in historical and regional context that includes the Iran-Iraq war, the downing of the Iran Air civilian flight 655 in 1988 by a missile from the USS Vincennes. So I quote, "The history of the last 40 years, and even before that, tells us well that America has constantly had great animosity to the great nation Iran and other nations in the region." So here we see how Rouhani links it to other events that are seen in terms of US hegemony. The coup d'etat against Mossadeg's government, American interference in the previous regime in Iran, support for Saddam and the shooting down of the passenger airline, the killing of innocent human beings by the American Navy, and the actions against the people of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Yemen, and the Middle East region in North Africa, end quote. We know from other texts, such as those I've highlighted in previous slides, that the people in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Yemen are seen in terms of the oppressed in relation to an external aggressor. Our knowledge of politics in the region tells us that for Iran, the external aggressor, and therefore the oppressor in this context, is the US and Saudi Arabia. Thus, Rouhani carefully equates Iran in its relationship with the Trump administration with the experience of Yemenis, Iraqis, and Afghans in their fight. As I mentioned, the narrative of defence in relation to actors that are constructed in terms of conspiracy, arrogance, sedition, oppression, and imposition of violence is prevalent in Rouhani's texts. It is also noted above that included in Khomeini's own narrative for the sake of defence is steadfastness. This varies depending on the context, and I'd like to draw attention to one final text. This is a speech given on the 22nd of September 2019 to mark the commemoration of the Sacred Defence or Iran-Iraq War. In terms of context, it is essential to note that the implications of Trump leaving the JCPOA was renewed economic sanctions. As part of Trump's policy of maximum pressure, sanctions were reimposed. The first round was implemented on the 7th of August 2018. The second round was implemented in November 2018. And this is referred to as economic warfare in Rouhani's texts. This period has also witnessed heightened tensions between the US and Iran, primarily in the Persian Gulf. As Edward Wastage has highlighted, in May 2019, on the anniversary of the US withdrawal from the agreement, Rouhani announced that Iran would begin to scale back its compliance with certain aspects of the JCPOA, in areas including the resale of its stockpile of low-enriched uranium and the limits set on uranium enrichment. By mid-2019, a number of vessels in the Persian Gulf came under attack, and the US blamed Iran and subsequently announced increased US presence in the Persian Gulf. In early 2019, an Iranian oil tanker off the coast of Gibraltar was seized by the UK. As Edward Wasnich has highlighted, the UK Ministry of Defence argued that the vessel was in breach of the EU sanctions on Bashar al-Assad. Iran accused the UK of piracy. In response, Iran seized a UK vessel in the Persian Gulf, which was still in Iranian hands at the time of the speech that we're going to look at. It should be noted that in November 2019, Rouhani and Zarif launched a coalition for hope, or almost peace endeavour, to address peace and security in the Persian Gulf. So here I've taken some statements from this statement of defence, this speech given on the anniversary of the State of Defence. Rouhani starts the speech by stating that we, that is Iran, are people of defence who are not inclined to submit and allow anyone to violate our borders. He goes on to reflect on the state of defence. This account clearly echoes Khomeini's narrative of the war. Crucially, the oppressor here is the Arab oppressor. As we know, both Saudi Arabia and Kuwait helped fund Saddam Hussein's campaign against Iran. I find the statement interesting, this one, so Khomeini issued the first edict to the people for steadfastness in face of the conspirators. Steadfastness is a term that I've come across many times in Rouhani's texts, and I had not appreciated the significance until I was looking at the legacy of the Iran-Iraq War. That perhaps the roots of this term, steadfastness in face of the aggressor, lies in Khomeini's analysis of the Iran-Iraq War, or actually mobilization. I also find Rouhani's use of Aflaqiyan to refer to Iraq and Saddam Hussein very interesting. As I'm not familiar with the language used by Islamic Republic elites during the war, it took a while to work out what it meant. It is of course a reference to the Syrian intellectual Michel Aflaq, who was one of the founders of Baathism and the Baath Party that would come to rule Syria through Hafiz al-Assad and Iraq through Saddam Hussein. I also find it interesting that the term Iraq is not actually used in this speech. When Rouhani turns to the events at the time of the speech, he continues to use the Iran-Iraq War narrative. Rouhani links the past and the present by linking the sacred defence with the US sanctions imposed by Trump's abrogation of the JCPOA. This is done by equating the two in terms of struggle against an aggressor. He also states that just as the Iranian nation showed themselves facing the Aflaqiyan and Baath Party during the sacred defence, today they have the capability to stand against the power of arrogance. The reference to the aim to annihilate the revolution through the imposition of economic war refers to Trump's plans for regime change along with sanctions. In a number of texts, Rouhani openly discusses the idea of regime change from outside and the inability for this to actually happen in practice. Rouhani also legitimizes Iran's role against the oppressor by once again equating Iran and the armed forces with security in Syria, Iraq, Palestine, and Lebanon. The oppressor, on the other hand, has brought insecurity to Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Persian Gulf. In more recent texts addressing Iran-Iraq relations, such as transcripts between Rouhani and the Iraqi Prime Minister, Iraq is referred to in terms of neighbour, partner, and maintaining peace and security in the region, and a brother. So I'm going to turn to my concluding points, and I have just 4 points that I would like to make. First, the legacy of the Iran-Iraq War does play a role, but we need to be careful not to overemphasize the role that it plays and be aware that circumstances do change and the Islamic Republic of Iran does have the agency to deal with these changes as they see fit in view of their own national interests. However, what will happen with the new nuclear deal remains to be seen. The second point I'd like to make is about agency, in the context of international relations and discussions about who has the ability to act in IR and who doesn't. So in IR, we must appreciate the agency of all actors to engage with ideas such as those associated with what is referred to as a Western liberal world order. In Rouhani's case, this is done to address power relations in the international system. The third point I'd like to say is that I'm very aware that my focus has been on Rouhani. A more comprehensive analysis would need to look at other Islamic Republic of Iran actors, such as the current president, supreme leader, and the IRGC. And of course, if we want to really look at the interplay between domestic and international politics, more attention also needs to be paid to domestic dynamics. And my last comment thought is that we mustn't forget about Iraq. So, Obviously, regional dynamics are included in that is the legacy of the 2003 Iraq War, which is historical context, of course, of the Iran-Iraq War. And not long after Rouhani gave the speech on the sacred defense, there's a series of uprisings and protests, which in Iraq has come to be referred to as the Tishri Revolution and or movement. So we need to bear in mind also Iran's actions and discourse in the context of wider regional dynamics. Thank you.
Thank you very much for perfect timing. It's 7 o'clock sharp. I don't know how you made it. I've been told by the organizers that we must absolutely leave the room by 7 o'clock. So unfortunately, I think it's a sign of a good conference that we are left for the desire for more time to keep discussing all the interesting things we've heard throughout the afternoon. I think there will be time at dinner for continuing this conversation in a more relaxed atmosphere. So thank you very much. And we need instructions on how to reach the restaurant.
We meet at the